Good morning, everybody. Good morning, good morning, good morning. I'd love for everyone to take a moment and find a place to sit. We're going to get started. Is this too loud? Can you hear me? Everybody hears me okay? Perfect. My name is Dunni Cosey. I'm going to be your cruise ship director for today. So I will make sure you don't end up on the rooftop with beers or anything like that, at least until the appropriate time, okay? In the mean and in between time, we're going to turn the microphone over to our awesome host. I'd like for you to give a warm welcome to Erin Aleman, who is the Executive Director of CMAP.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Dunni. And thanks everyone for being here today in our space here at the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. We are always thrilled to be a convener, help build partnerships, especially on important issues like accessory dwelling units, affordable housing. And so for those of you who don't know who CMAP is, we're the regional planning agency for Northeastern Illinois. And we were created in 2005 to really combine transportation and land use effectively. So a lot of our budget these days has been focused on transportation dollars, but as I was sharing with Dunni this morning is that we're very excited that the new transportation bill says that regional agencies shall be involved in regional housing strategies. So, you know, CMAP has, and our predecessor agencies have a long history with housing, but we just haven't quite had the funding to be able to bring these things together. And we know it's so important for the way that we think about our land, the way we think about transportation access, to make sure that we're thinking about the people who live in communities and how they're getting to the places that we need to go. And also we do a lot of work on understanding who's living in this region. And so as our communities begin to age, you know, how we house residents of our region or how we think about people and economic recovery, my microphone got there, how we think about economic recovery and the role that housing plays and stable housing plays is just so important to our region and to our region's success. You know, and I think just personally, one of the things that I've been just so pleased to have personally in my life is that my mom retired, she moved to the region, she takes my kids to school, she picks them up at the end of the day. But, you know, for a retired mom, you know, having her a little bit farther away, I keep saying I need a house that can support my mom. And my mother-in-law just moved from Cleveland to Chicago. And again, I was like, if I could have a place where I could have both my mother-in-laws, maybe I'm crazy. But I probably regret that actually. But you know, when I think about family, right? Having them nearby as they age is just so important. It's good for my kids. It's good for them. And so I think, again, the conversation that you're having today is just so important. And we are excited for you to learn from one another. We're excited about the dozen communities across our region that have changed their zoning requirements to help support greater housing choice in our region. And I think, again, as you think about the seat that you're in, I hope that today you get some takeaways as to what you can do to further our inclusive and thriving region by allowing for all sorts of different housing types. So again, I wanted to just give you a little bit of thoughts as to why CMAP cares about this. Also just welcome you to our space here and hope that you have a lovely day. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks again, Erin. So as I said, we've got a lot to cover today. So I'll go over the agenda. I'm going to go over quite a few things, and then we'll kick the program off with our keynote address and jump into a day filled with wonderful conversation, discussion, panels, and some lunch and coffee breaks. So, I mean, that's kind of like the perfect day, I'm just saying. All right, so I wrote my remarks down because I don't want to forget anything. Before we get started, I want us to thank the thought leaders behind today. If you could wave your hand, I'm sure all of you have said good morning to Steve Vance from Cityscape and Emily Bloom-Carlin, who's our Senior Program Officer at the Compact. I'd also like to give a shout out to our folks sitting and staffing the desk where you got your really cool name badges and the really cool programs and artwork that you see. Please wave your hand for me, Cassidy Kramer. She's also Preservation Compact. And a lot of work went into planning today. Very thoughtful, long discussions with CMAP, with Steve, with the compact, we all got together and just really dove into this space. So I want to make sure everyone understands that everything that you're doing here today has been carefully curated. I also want to acknowledge CIC. Stacy Young is our fearless CEO and president. She is out conquering the world in Rosemont today. So we're going to take over the downtown area, but there's a lot of really cool folks here from CIC and CII. So thank you for being here to support us today. And I have the pleasure of working with Emily. And so in the Preservation Compact, we are a policy and research collaborative focused on preserving the region's stock of affordable rental housing, so both subsidized and unsubsidized. And so we see ADUs as an important part of our work on preservation. Even before the recent policy changes, the Chicago region has a long standing existing stock of ADUs, primarily basement units and also coach houses. These existing ADUs tend to be more affordable than other types of units, but may have deferred maintenance needs that need to be addressed. So in addition to becoming an increasingly popular housing option for homeowners, there's a lot of perks to that. It increases your property value, generates rental income, and provides flexible housing option for their families. So just as Erin said, having folks closer to you so that you can kind of keep your tribe or your community central to what you need to thrive. As housing prices continue to rise, ADUs can also offer the affordable solution for multi-generational families, retirees, young professionals looking for affordable housing options. But we believe encouraging more ADUs, particularly basement units, could add to the naturally occurring stock that we're trying so dearly hard to preserve. So our thought around that is that we can help stabilize owner occupants and help to discourage the two flats from being, I'm going to say the scary word, deconverted into single family homes. So let's all make sure we're keeping that central to our thoughts and ask the questions and get outside the box here in this space. And I just saw Dan walk in. Hey, Dan. We're very excited to be here today to offer a preview of what we'll be doing today. We have quite a few panel discussions. We've got our municipal panel that will be led by Jake Side. We've got our ADU project panel that will be led by Catherine Darnstadt. And then we have our financing and resources panel, which will be led by our very own Emily. And then we'll have a coffee break in between, and then we'll grab some lunch. And then Steve Vance will close us out with a discussion before we head into the ending activity of the day. So if you signed up for the tour, then that will happen after lunch and after that discussion with Steve. But before we move to our keynote, I want to recognize the important work of our compact partners, and she's going to get me for doing this, but I'm going to do it anyway. Diane Lemus and Communities United, all of the leadership there, you are an important catalyst for the ADU conversations in Chicago. And you've lifted up the importance of improving conditions in our existing stock. Basement ADUs without displacing tenants is huge work, and you all have definitely led the charge. So please, let's acknowledge Diane's crew for that, and Communities United. We've also got, I met one of my NHS folks, but we've got Donna Clark and the NHS team who are on the ground working tirelessly to develop innovative tools to help low and moderate income homeowners of color enjoy the benefit of ADUs. That's huge, because a lot of the conversation you hear around ADUs from some policymakers, I'll be very vague, it rhymes with Schmalderman, will often say things like, well, how do my people afford this? And so to have folks who are being intentional in that space is also very critical to how this will work. And also I have to pay homage to the former director of the Compact. Stacy gave me big shoes to fill. I think I'm doing it. I don't think I've tripped too much, but it's important to acknowledge Stacy's work because she was on the steering committee of ULI's ADU Initiative Task Force and chaired the ADU Policy Committee. So we appreciate her putting her shoulders up for us to stand on. And of course, our government partners, Daniel Hertz Big shout out to you and the squad at DOH who have championed the value of ADUs and navigated the long and often complicated process of developing and implementing ADU programs. So thank you again. Let's give those folks a good round of applause for it. So I'm done talking, because if you haven't figured it out, I could probably just talk to you about a whole bunch of things that are not on this program, and then I get in trouble later, so I'm not going to do that. But what I am going to do is bring someone to the stage who is pretty amazing to this space. Another vital partner on ADU policy in the region is Swasti Shah. She's the Director of Community Engagement at the Urban Land Institute. Swasti led the ULI ADU task force that many of the folks in this room participated on and played a vital role in implementation of the city's ADU pilot program. Without further ado, please welcome our keynote speaker, Swasti, to the stage.
Thank you so much, Dunni. I'm so pleased to be here today. It's really wonderful to see all of us gathered to be talking about ADUs again. We've done a lot, but there is a lot more to do, and I really believe this is the best way to go about doing it. So thank you for being here, and thank you for inviting me. I have a few slides that I want to share, but before I do that, I want to share an experience, and it kind of builds on things that Erin and Dunni both hinted at. But sort of a personal experience for which for me highlights why I really believe that ADUs are an important housing type to have in our neighborhoods. So I have this big picture window in my kitchen, which is a nice view of my yard and my neighbor's backyard. So in the mornings when I'm rushing around, like making breakfast, packing lunches, and so forth, I get a glimpse also into the morning routine of my neighbors. And pretty much every day, Grandpa, who lives on the coach house above the garage, is out walking his cute little dog, Jojo. And just a few minutes later, his two little granddaughters come running out of the front house, the main house on the lot, to play with the dog. And I believe, to greet Grandpa as well. But it's such a lovely way to start your morning, right? And the similar scene sort of plays out throughout the day. Game of catch with Grandpa after school, or like when it's nicer out, they're out like cycling, like barbecuing, things like that. I just love to see this close intergenerational family. And I believe, and I mean, I have to believe that at least a part of it is because of their living situation. The grandpa and grandkids are such an integral part of each other's lives because they live right next to each other. Like Erin was saying, wouldn't it be lovely, even though it might be a mother-in-law or your mother, to have them close by? And do we not want that for all families? Do we not want more people to have that option? And so, that's why I believe ADUs are important. I also realize that my neighbors have certain advantages. Their coach house was built decades ago, and people who own that property and they themselves have all the resources to really kept up the coach house. It's well maintained with modern amenities. It's a great place to be. And not all of us have the financial resources or the technical wherewithal or the time to build an ADU to keep it up. So, those are real challenges, but also challenges worth really solving. And I think the best way to go about doing it is through convenings like this. So because when we bring our collective knowledge and effort to the forefront, we can make a difference. And it is with this belief is when ULI Chicago, Emily, could you move to the next slide? Launched the ADU initiative, which Dunni alluded to back in 2019, which feels like such a long time ago. But we wanted to bring together industry members, community leaders, so many of you were a part of that conversation, and city representatives to really think through how we can provide a framework that could sort of be a really smart way to craft an ADU policy for the city of Chicago and for other communities in the region. So as you see in this photo, we had lots of like convenings over various several months, and we we sort of use the on the ground knowledge of the people who were participating, but also looked at best practices across the country. So there were several cities who had already had ADU policies in place with varied levels of success, and we were able to learn from them and sort of take the best of their policies to provide a framework for our region and the city. So next slide. And I want to share some findings and recommendations, well, more findings from that initiative, because I think they're all pretty relevant today. You already heard many of these things. Why do we want ADUs? Because they provide housing choice for families to live together, but also just for folks who might want a smaller footprint for their housing and to live in a certain neighborhood. ADUs can provide that. They are also, I'm going to look at my slide, they are a way to provide housing stability. The additional rental income from the extra unit could be a way to help pay your mortgage. It could also, Dunni would love that. You know, we don't have hard data on that, but the ability to add an additional unit and get additional income from that might sway somebody from keeping that 2 flat and adding that 3rd unit versus moving towards deconversion. And another key part is that it's using existing infrastructure. It's using the roadway network, the water sewer lines that we already have in place, all the amenities, whether it's transit, shops, schools, and in a kind of a gentler way of adding just more density to the neighborhood fabric that already exists. And the flip side of it is that when you bring in more people, you have more people to support your existing businesses and services. And we all know that there are many neighborhoods that are struggling with that. So there are many advantages to them. Next slide, please. But there are also a lot of key challenges. And just the first one being that if you're not allowed to, if you're zoning, your building permits, or you know, the regulatory environment is not supportive, you cannot really build them. Even if you permit ADUs, but you have a bunch of restrictions which make it almost impossible to build it on a lot, you're not going to see many of them. And then just the cost of it. It's cheaper to build an accessory dwelling unit, but it's not exactly cheap. And that's a huge barrier for many folks. And when that is a barrier, it sort of gets compounded when accessing financing specifically for ADUs is harder. There are fewer loan products out there that will help you build that. And so unless people have the financial wherewithal themselves, whether it's through savings or through enough home equity in their main home, it's not so easy to get the loan or the money that you need to be able to finance and build an ADU. And, you know, we are seeing sort of repercussions of that throughout sort of our region. And I think this is sort of the key point, the last point, that most of the people who we want to be building ADUs are regular homeowners. They are not developers. They are not necessarily even professionals in this industry. So it's that much harder for them to navigate all these challenges and to be able to build that ADU. So we have to be mindful of how we make things as easy and as simple as possible. Next slide. This is a great map, which I think illustrates that the potential. We have 270 plus some municipalities, and we have a handful of them who've already sort of moved forward in that, but it sort of shows you also the opportunity. I think the colors on the map are great because these are communities that are already sort of moving forward, but all the white space is where the opportunity is as well. So thank you, Seema, for mapping that out for us. Next slide. And this is slightly older data, but I kept it in there because it's still really relevant. The left side, the sort of the chart on the left is from Portland, and the chart on the right is from Seattle, and it maps sort of the progress of how many ADUs were permitted in those cities once they kind of flipped the switch or legalized ADUs. And they said, okay, you can build ADUs, but then ADUs didn't really materialize very easily for all the reasons that we discussed, that they're hard to do. It took a lot of different kinds of interventions, whether it was adjusting sort of their zoning to reducing the requirements or increasing the FAR or a bunch of those types of things which actually made the ADUs feasible, or like coming up with just ways to disseminate information, financial support, things like that to start to ramp up production. And that's like an important lesson to remember, that even after we pass the ordinance, we legalize ADUs, it's really important to revisit, to assess where we are and what more we need to do to really get the outcome that we are hoping for. And so that's why it's wonderful to see everyone here today. I think this is a great way to kind of keep moving on those conversations. Next slide. And this just sort of going back to the city and where we are. The city of Chicago is right now, as I think most of you know, allowing ADUs only in like 5 pilot locations. And I looked at Stephen Vance's website, which is a great way to like sort of understand what's happening for all kinds of stuff, but definitely also for how the ADU building permits are going. So as you can see in the chart, we have until I guess May 1st of this year to hit the 2-year mark. So we might be pretty close to 200. Did I get that wrong? So we might be close to getting 200 building, units permitted in our first 2 years, which is better than what a lot of other places were able to do. And that's great. But if you dive a little bit deeper, you see that almost all of these units are in the north and the northwest pilot zones. We have only a handful. And I kind of counted, and I think I counted less than 10 in the 3 other southeast and the west zones. And so that right there is our work cut out for us. Next slide. And so this is where I think I'm going to stop, but sort of our work begins. What's next for Chicago? What's next for our region? A lot of opportunity to really make this program more widely available and also, have a much more equitable impact than what we are having by making, easier for people in all parts of the city and the region to be able to build ADUs, to be able to live in them. So I'm looking forward to this discussion and hearing from all of you. And with that, I'm going to close. Thank you for inviting me.
All right. Thank you for that, Swasti. So our next panel, it's really kind of cool the way this was organized. One huge part about this work is that we actually had to get it passed so that it can be figured out, right? And so there's just a few zones that are designated in the city where ADUs are, we're doing our pilot program where ADUs are permitted. But something important about this work is to keep the conversation going so that folks can have a deeper understanding about the importance and the value add. So I think it's so fitting that our first panel of the day will be the municipal panel. I'm going to introduce Jake Side, who is the founding principal of Sightline Planning and Zoning, with more than 15 years of experience in zoning, land use planning, and community engagement. He has made significant contributions to the field by creating user-friendly zoning codes, supporting land use flexibility, and developing strategies to promote housing choice. Previously, Jake worked as a regional planner with CMAP. Welcome home, Jake. And at Camiros, and was a member of the ULI ADU task force. He has also served on the executive board of the Illinois chapter of the American Planning Association for more than a decade, including a 2-year stint as president. See, when you leave the presidency, you get to do more stuff. So way to go, Jake. All right, I'll bring Jake to the podium or the table. Emily, are we sitting at the table? And then Jake will introduce the other panelists, and I'll see y'all in just a short bit. Welcome, Jake. Everybody, let's give Jake a welcome.
All righty. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to see all of you today. Thank you very much for the warm introduction, Dunni, and to Erin, Aleman, and all the folks at CMAP for hosting us today. This panel is going to look at ADUs with regard to the balance between 3 big Ps: planning, politics, and the public. And our municipal practitioners here today are going to help us get the lay of the land on that at the municipal and at the regional level. So we're going to look at also what's happening in the city of Chicago. So buckle up. This is going to be interesting. Let's start out with some introductions. If you could just provide your name, your title, the community you work with, and then two kind of introductory questions, what housing issues you're facing or addressing, and where ADUs are allowed in your community. Let's start with Daniel.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. My name is Daniel K. Hertz. I'm the Director of Policy Research and Legislative Affairs for the Department of Housing at the City of Chicago. And the opening question was, where are ADUs allowed? So we just saw a map of it. There's five pilot areas around the city: north, northwest, west, south, and southeast. They cover around, Stephen just told me this the other day, 24%, am I remembering correctly, of the eligible residential, what would be the eligible residential areas of the city.
And Daniel, any major housing issues that the ADUs are facing, or is that too big of a question to start out with?
I was just gonna say yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we've across the city in the different areas where it's allowed and not allowed, I think, yeah, we're seeing basically every iteration of some of the things that Swasti talked about, that Dunni was talking about. So yeah, I know we're gonna get into that in a minute.
Excellent. And Craig.
Craig Failer, I'm the village planner for the Villageville Park. I manage the planning, zoning, and historic preservation functions for the village. As far as where ADUs are allowed, they're allowed wherever there is a single family home, regardless of what the zoning is. We want to make sure that anyone has the opportunity to do an ADU if they live in a single family home. As far as housing issues, I guess the biggest issue we're looking at is really, I don't know if you want to call it the missing middle or whatever you want to call it, but we do have a lot of affordable housing within our community, within our multifamily districts, and which are, apartments or condominiums, but we don't really have a lot of affordable housing options within our single family neighborhoods. So this was something that we looked at, and I can get into a little bit more later.
Great. And Curtis.
Yeah, hi, Curtis Cosey, Community and Economic Development Director with the Village of Bensenville. For those of you not aware, we are the western edge of O'Hare Airport. We had about 10% of our land area kind of eaten up when they expanded here, so we have a lot of housing issues in the village. We had gone through a couple LTA grants with Jake, redid our comp plan, redid our zoning ordinance, and attempted to approve ADUs. Unfortunately, we did not get it passed. This was back in 2018. So even prior to some of the ULI stuff that was going on. Housing issues in Bensenville. I mean, we are a DuPage County, mostly. Small community, 18,000, very affordable, about 50-50 minority, so mostly Latino, a lot of big immigrant community. So a lot of low income, a lot of seniors. We have a ton of senior housing. To us, ADUs were a aging in place sort of conversation, a missing middle conversation, not necessarily an affordability conversation, although it does play some into it. But a little unique, I think, where we come from from ADUs. So.
Great. Well, thank you all. And, like Dunni said, I'm moderating this panel because I've worked at CMAP for more than 10 years. And just want to give that regional perspective on things before we dive down deep with these fellows. We wanted to talk about the experience that CMAP's had with working with municipalities, large and small in the region. And I just wanted to provide a few examples of how that process has gone. So, Erin alluded to that CMAP was formed in 2005. Curtis mentioned our LTA program that starts for local technical assistance. And that program's been going strong since about 2010. Since that time, CMAP's worked with dozens of communities. We've worked with hundreds of projects, and especially around things like comprehensive planning and housing analysis. Through the planning and housing work, we have a common theme, a common finding, and that is that many of these communities need to provide a greater range of housing options, right? So we'll work with them. My colleague Enrique Castillo is in the room. has been looking at some of these programs through the homes program and, trying to show the mismatch between your demographics in your community and the housing stock in your community, right? Especially if the planning principles are things like aging in place, how can you address that gap? So in our, our planner's toolbox, one of our big implementation tools is the zoning code. Swasti alluded to how important that is with ADUs. And CMAP's worked on about 24 ordinances at this point, and that's from soup to nuts. So a complete zoning rewrite, an overhaul of your ordinance to a more targeted approach based on a specific issue. And we saw the regional map before. I'm not sure if why don't we bring that back up, but the map that CMAP put together, we've got about less than 10 communities that currently allow ADUs in the 7-county region around Chicago. Thank you, Emily. And another handful that are exploring it right now. CMAP's working with the city of Waukegan and the village of Oswego, but also a number of other communities that are looking at those under consideration. So the issue that we get at with our local leaders as we, form these partnerships and have these conversations is that, there's a spectrum of options when you're either deciding to allow or prohibit ADUs, right? The zoning districts in which it's allowed, Craig already alluded to that, whether they're attached, detached, square footage caps, the tendency of the owner, whether they have to live on site, things like parking and design requirements, all these kind of factors come into play. And the, underlying issue here is something that planners deal with every day, which is things like community character and issues of change, right? Because in a suburban context in particular, change can be scary. So, we've got levels of approval when we start talking about ADUs, right? We start out with staff and, Curtis has been great. When we worked with him in Berwyn, when we worked with him in Bensonville, they're totally on board. They've read the same articles in Planning Magazine from the American Planning Association. They know what's up and they want to allow them in as many places as possible. And they're acutely aware of the needs of the community as well. We often work with the steering committee, right? So there's another level of approval there. Generally, these are stakeholders in the community, people who live there for a long time. And, for them, it's more of an education process, but they generally get on board. Then we go to Plan Commission and the Village Board. And, that is a horse of a different color. We've got, public hearings that are there, public meetings, and it gets interesting. Our colleague at CMAP, Jane Grover, says that when you have meetings like that, yes stays home, but no goes to the meeting. So there's people there in full throat telling you what's wrong with ADUs and why they should not be part of the community. And that's when it becomes a negotiated process. So a few quick examples of CMAP's experience. I've got, I think, 4 or 5 here before we talk to our panelists, our esteemed panelists. The first community that we worked with that allowed ADUs was the village of Park Forest. That's down in South Cook on the border of Will County. They've allowed ADUs since 2017. The issue there is that housing in that area is pretty affordable. And so there hasn't been a big uptake in ADUs because the expense of building one doesn't really match up with the expense of buying a house that's already there. Out in Kane County, we've completed unified development ordinances in South Elgin and Montgomery. And in those communities, they've seen a lot of growth. A lot of their housing growth was in the 90s, the early 2000s. And ADU uptake has been limited there because of homeowners associations and restrictive deeds and covenants, which actually supersede zoning. So that's been an issue. And there's one community that my colleague Jamie Jackson and I worked with that shall remain nameless. We were brought in for a more targeted approach on that project. They had approved a housing plan that specifically called for allowing ADUs. And once we got to the meeting, this was during COVID times, Jamie was there and we quickly found out that while the village board was adamantly for ADUs, the Plan Commission was adamantly against it. And we couldn't even get the ADUs heard at that meeting. And so we ended up backing out, which was unfortunate. So all that to say that CMAP has really seen it all when it comes to ADUs out in the region. We're still finding ways for communities to say yes to change and housing choice, and hopefully more ADUs in the future. So that is the region in a nutshell, but let's get to your communities here, gentlemen. let's go from a policy perspective. We were curious, who helped make ADUs a possibility in terms of local officials, staff, and even things like community advocates, the Stephen Vances of the world. So Daniel, why don't we start with you on that one?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, I think in Chicago, certainly all of the above. I think, you know, Dunni, I think, mentioned the work of groups like Communities United and others who I think had been coming at it from one angle, which was seeing, you know, the loss of affordability and of sort of unsubsidized low and moderate cost housing, and really identifying, you know, garden units as one of the sources of, you know, of that kind of housing, right? And realizing, number one, that it was difficult for new garden units to be created, but number two, that a lot of the existing ones were actually not legally units, right? And didn't have a path to becoming units without a zoning change that in Chicago, I don't know how it works in you guys' cities, but in Chicago has to be an active, the full council, right? So it's a high bar, it's an expensive bar to clear. We had other folks like AARP, who obviously really feel strongly about the aging in place side of it. I think, you know, others who were looking at the spree of deconversions and the loss of 2 to 4, 2 to 6 unit type buildings in the city, and, you know, what are ways for us to add more of that. I don't love the phrase gentle density, but, you know, that type of sort of low density multifamily housing. So yeah, I mean, so it was a wide variety of folks, and then, you know, obviously the ULI task force was really instrumental, I think, in sort of channeling that energy and that interest. That formed a little bit before I arrived at the city, so that was already in place when I arrived at the city. And then, you know, I think it was also just, you know, folks who live in the city who saw the usefulness of this, whether it's because they own their home and they want to, you know, they wanted to create an ADU for their kid or their mom or whoever to move into, or, you know, they wanted to see, they were a renter and they wanted to see more lower moderate cost rental housing options in their neighborhood. And so, you know, I think, so, you know, in Chicago, we, although you saw the map of the pilot zones, we actually initially introduced in the spring of 2020 a citywide ordinance, and we were hopeful that we would pass that. And then there was a subject matter hearing in the summer, and all of the sort of fears and, you know, there's not going to be enough parking, you know, this isn't fair because, you know, we had people say this, like, this isn't fair because my constituents have earned living in a single family home neighborhood and they shouldn't have to live on the same block with renters if they don't want to, you know, everything else. And, you know, the council ended up saying, you know, this needs to be a pilot program first. And so, but we were able to get as you saw on the screen, buy-in from a wide swath of communities on the north side, northwest, west, south, and southeast, who, you know, did say that, yeah, this makes sense for us and we want to see how this goes. And so it was really important to us when we realized we were going to end up with a pilot approach, that we had a full cross section of, you know, housing market types, you know, building stock types, but also, you know, in a city as diverse and segregated as Chicago, you know, racial demographics, you know, economic profiles. And I think we did get that. And, you know, there's value to that, right? Not just because everybody should have access to this, but also because, you know, it's made very stark a lot of the challenges that Swasti talked about earlier, which is like, look, you can't just sort of open the door and expect everything to work fine, you know, all over the city. You need to be putting in more resources. And so I think that has illustrated as we move forward with this, that, you know, there's a lot more work to do.
Absolutely. Craig, how about in Oak Park?
Sure. You know, there was a lot of factors that kind of came together at the right time, at the right place to move this issue forward. I mean, Oak Park has always allowed coach houses ever since its existence. So there was always that ADU element that Oak Park had just from the get-go. But at one point, the village did not allow the reuse of those, and they were kind of grandfathered in, but we didn't allow them to be constructed anymore. But then we saw a resurgence of residents who wanted to do just that and build coach houses in their backyards. And so some were built illegally, but we decided that this was probably a good time to kind of look at that issue. Also, there was a group called Arbor West that was formed in the Village of Oak Park, which is a group of older adults who were looking at aging in place issues for Oak Park. And, you know, they brought that to our attention as well. They wanted to stay in their single family residential neighborhoods, but they were being aged out of place. And also we saw the kids who were growing up in Oak Park. They couldn't stay in Oak Park. They couldn't afford to stay in Oak Park. So we wanted to look at maybe places that they could live as well. The village actually created an aging in place commission who's looking at a lot of these issues. And we did a lot of research from other communities. We actually had 2 iterations of ADUs within our zoning code. In 2017, maybe about sometime as Park Forest started looking at theirs, we allowed coach houses again when we did our rewrite of our zoning code with Camiros, who did a good job on that. And we saw, you know, a few coach houses being built, but then we started getting questions from the public about what, you know, I want to convert my attic or I want to convert my basement. We really didn't allow that at this point. So in 2021, we started looking at opening up the offerings for ADUs within the community. And we didn't really get a lot of pushback from the Plan Commission or the village board. I think they were all really excited about it. We wanted to make sure that we could provide an affordable option as well. As I mentioned earlier, there aren't as many affordable units within our single family neighborhoods that there could be. I think it's been semi-successful as far as ADU development. What we've seen though is that people have only built coach houses. So the folks who are interested in the attics and the basements, we really haven't seen them come through yet. But we did, when we first put out the requirements, there were a lot of restrictions because it's kind of our pilot program for the village. You had to have a certain lot size, building could be only a certain size. So when we did the revision in 2022, we took that restriction away. So it could be on any lot where there's a single family home. We do have some restrictions on it as far as how it looks. It has to comport with the house, the main house. You have to have its own address. There's no parking requirements for any of the ADUs. The only size requirement we have are on additions to a single family home. So I should say all the things that we offer now are coach houses, living units above garages, additions to single family homes up to 1,000 square feet, a standalone ADU up to 1,000 square feet, and then conversions of attics and basements. And I'll give a shout out to AARP. I know there's a representative here somewhere. At least they were on the list. They had a great explanation of all the different types of ADUs that we kind of incorporated into our zoning code. So
Great. Thanks for that overview, Craig. And so Curtis, a little bit of a different path in Bensonville. Do you want to give us an overview of what happened there?
Yeah, so, yeah, like I said earlier, I guess, unfortunately, we were not able to pass it in our zoning ordinance rewrite. So we have planned a lot around, we've done the changing in region, you know, the homes. We've recently even done another plan, aging in a changing region. All of these studies have talked about ADUs as an option, something we should look into. We got it through planning and it's in our comp plan. It talks about it, you know, that was an approved plan. We rolled that right into doing the zoning ordinance. I mean, I think what I find interesting about these two communities are like the community actually wanting, like asking about ADUs, how can I do this or how can I make them legal? We didn't have a lot of that. We're not having a lot of people coming to us saying, hey, how can I build a coach house? I think it was Jake and the team, and just myself and experience and realizing this should be an option and just noticing kind of broader issues in the community and thinking this would be a good option to address some of these issues. But we didn't really have a lot of necessarily champions in the community, and that's probably been part of the downfall, right? What we did have, which we have a lot of existing ADUs in the community. There are not so much coach houses. There are a lot of ADUs. There are ADUs above garages, attached. I mean, our mayor at the time actually was looking at buying a home with an ADU with the specific purpose of putting his mother-in-law in there. So we thought we were on good ground. So it was written in the original ordinance, made it, I think, I was just looking at the versions last night, the different drafts. I think it made it through version 5, which is past planning commission, but essentially it was taken out in the attorney review, which means it was taken out in the political review. Jake talked about the no's at the community meetings. I can really only think of one family that was the no, and that's the reason it was pulled out. So one family, for the whole community decided the issue. We were okay with it in a sense. We kind of slid another thing in there that we find sort of attacks the issue in the same way. We allowed 2 flats by right in almost every zoning district, which was, we had a bunch of non-conforming 2 flats. No one said anything about that. So that's something that we thought we not got over on them, but in a sense helped address some of the affordability issues. And then at the same time, we still have this ADU language we're ready to attack. When we think the time is right, we're going to try to do this again. Like I said, I think we were early, right? CMAP was sort of ahead of the game, and it's getting the ball rolling. Swasti talked about this earlier about even, the ULI and the continued conversations. And I think once more communities start getting on board and we get more than the handful on the list that have approved it, I think we can go back to our community and say, hey, this is something we should be doing. And we got that language just ready to kind of pop into the zoning ordinance. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That map is pretty splotchy at this point, right? There hasn't been that, massive critical mass of communities that are doing it. But yeah, the Bensenville example goes to show how, it sometimes doesn't matter how many people are against ADUs. It's how big of a voice they have or how much, political juice they have in the community that can actually, derail some of these projects. So my next question for you all is a little bit more kind of in the weeds. This is the stuff that planners love, but getting more into kind of what Craig was talking about how it was a negotiated process. And I think Daniel will start with you on this, but how did you land on things like, those maps of how they were created and what neighborhoods it was going to be allowed in, attached, detached, square footage, design requirements, all that good stuff?
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of the geography, I think, again, we from a staff perspective, we were really committed to the idea of, all right, if we're going to have the sort of second best option of it's not going to be citywide, then we need to have an equitable distribution and a representative distribution of these pilot zones around the city, because both from an equity perspective, we're not comfortable just having a north side, pilot that excludes the rest of the city, but also, if the purpose is to learn about, all right, how does this work in different parts of the city, we actually need to apply it to different parts of the city. So, I mean, it was a process of, testing out community support, obviously council support, and, we were able to get, I'll share, without naming names, that, by the end of the process, we had gotten enough people on board and a large enough swath of the city that we had people coming to us saying, hey, wait a minute, I know that I was, expressing opposition a couple of weeks ago, but there's more of this than I thought there was going to be, and I don't want to be left out. So I need, part of my community to be covered, right? So
FOMO.
Yeah, right, exactly. And, I will say as an aside that since then, I have definitely gotten many calls from many calls from constituents who are, outside the zone saying like, when is this getting expanded? But also from, ward offices saying like, why is this not allowed in my community? And I sort of have to bite my tongue about like, well, partly because you said no. So that was a part of it. But then, the other side of the question in terms of the actual, like, the shape of the ordinance itself, You know, I think partly we're sort of lucky in that, you know, especially garden apartments and attic apartments are just such a like part of the built fabric of the city that it wasn't like we had to be like, oh, okay, so like what, you know, how big can these be, and how it really was just like, okay, you can add a garden unit, like just go, you know, do it the same way that you would if it was, you know, if your zoning was slightly different and you could add that unit anyway. For coach houses, it was a little bit more complex because it had been illegal to build new coach houses since the 50s in Chicago. And so there was a lot of talk. I mean, I think the primary concerns were around like, you know, a sense of wanting to leave some open space in the backyard, right? Chicago is by American standards, relatively dense city, but much of the city still, you know, has open backyards, and people value that, and people value the light and that space. So we wanted to make sure that there was some openness there. You know, one thing that I will say that I think is an area that, you know, could be revisited is, so Chicago has a one for outside the ADUs. No ADUs require any parking. But outside the ADUs, Chicago has a 1-for-1 parking requirement for most buildings, but a 2-for-1 requirement for single family homes. So single family home has to have 2 off-street parking spaces. And a standard city lot is generally between 25 and 30 feet wide. And what that means is that it is basically impossible in Chicago to build a coach house that is not above a garage, because there just is not room to fit 2 cars and a coach house, or else the coach house would have to be like this wide, right? And initially we were negotiating over, hey, let's say that we reduce the off-street parking requirement for single family homes to 1, right? The same what that it is for every other type of home. And that will allow people to build a ground floor coach house that would be accessible to people with mobility impairments, right? And then you can park 1 car alongside it. And in the negotiation process, that was, you know, that was given a red light. No, we have to keep 2 spots. And so as a result, it's basically illegal to build a handicap accessible coach house, which makes no sense, given that we want it to be something for aging in place, and also just because every new building should be accessible if that's at all possible. And so, you know, that's one area where I think we were not able to get where we wanted, and I think, you know, if we were to take another bite at the apple, that would be something for us to look at.
Fantastic. Yeah, and Craig, you alluded to, you know, some of the choices that you've made or that the village has made or city has made. Village, okay, sorry about that. On things like, you know, zoning districts and neighborhoods and that sort of thing. I guess from you, can you tell us a little bit about how it's going so far, and, you know, how many permits, how many have been built, and have you seen any patterns to locations of these types of ADUs?
Well, that's a good question. We, you know, since I've been keeping track of the ADUs since we did the amendment in 2022, January 2022, we've had 12 ADUs built, and they're all coach houses. I'd say about 75% of those are actually living units above a garage. The others are either recreation or office that are convertible into residential in the future. They meet all the requirements that we have set forth for the ADUs and for the zoning districts. We wish they would take a little bit more advantage of all the different offerings we have, but again, as Swasti indicated, that they're very expensive. I mean, coach houses are probably the more expensive of all the offerings that we have, but that seems to be the one that everyone is selecting at the moment. And we have smaller lots too, like Chicago, but not as small as Chicago. And I think open space in the backyards is important to people as well. So doing a 2-story garage with the coach house above is generally one of the best options they have to maintain their open space. So we've seen that investment in Oak Park, but like I said, we're hoping to see others, because we had some inquiries before about it, but we've never really seen anybody do it. I mean, I'm assuming there are probably units in the city, in the village, that have been done in those spaces without, maybe without permit or without acknowledging that they're a separate unit. One of the things that we were looking at when we were doing this is how does that impact the tax structure? And so we had a conversation with our township assessor about that. And what we found out was that if you built a standalone unit, whether it's a coach house or just a standalone unit, the tax structure doesn't change. He still looks at as a single family home or a second single family home. But if you were to attach it to your house or you do an attic or a basement, then they would look at it as a duplex and they would tax it accordingly. So it's a little different. And I think the village board at the time we adopted this was concerned about that, how it would change the tax structure in the village. And so we're keeping track of all of those ADUs. But again, all of them are coach houses, so the tax structure is not changing in any way.
That's a great point, Craig. Every time we go to a public meeting to talk about zoning, it becomes a tax meeting. So bringing up those issues is really important. As a kind of a segue, talked to our friends up in Evanston last week just to get some data from them about, how it's gone. They've been another big champion of ADUs in the region. They passed their ADU ordinance in 2018 and revised it in 2020. They allow it attached and detached. You don't need a special use permit or anything like that, and no additional parking is required. Prior to 2021, they had 10 applications and 5 were issued. And since 2021, they've had 25 applications and 12 have been issued. So about 22 new ADUs constructed in Evanston since that point. So, these are communities that are, facing a little bit more of a affordability and housing crunch than, the kind of places that CMAP has worked at in the past. But it was just interesting to kind of see that breakdown. But cognizant of the time, we've got about 15 minutes left, and we wanted to leave some room for questions. So I just wanted to end with a look into the future. Northbrook is the community that most recently passed an ADU ordinance, and it is pretty narrowly circumscribed. For them, you have to have a property owner to live on site, either in the principal structure or in the accessory structure. They have to be 55 or older or have a disability to live in the structure. So it's very narrowly tailored. But I know, these communities are on a very different path. I just kind of wanted to get a vibe from you on, will there be tweaks to the permitting ordinance? How are you helping to get the word out to address some of these missing middle needs? So Curtis, do you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, I sort of touched on it earlier, but the most recent planning study we just did was with MMC in the aging and changing region. So aging in place has been the biggest sort of topic lately. It was recently approved, and one of the probably 5 major recommendations is ADUs. We do think we will revisit ADUs at some point. It's all part of the same conversation to us, this kind of missing middle, aging in place thing, affordability. I mentioned the 2 flats. We are actually devising a pilot right now. We have a city-owned lot. We're gonna come up with pre-approved building plans for 2 flats. So we're gonna have a book of 5 architecturally pre-approved plans. And then we're going to test it on the city-owned lot that we have, and we're going to try to essentially sell that with one of the pre-approved plans. And then the idea would be to have those pre-approved plans for anybody that wants to build a 2-flat to come in and have a quicker approval, and not have to waste all their time on architectural things like that. So we're constantly thinking about ways to address these issues. ADUs is part of the conversation. We do think we'll be able to revisit it at some point, but we are working on similar issues basically concurrently.
Great. And Craig, how about you?
So we actually created a accessory dwelling unit guide that we have on our website that kind of tells you everything about ADUs and where they're allowed and what you can build and what you have to do as far as utilities and contacting the building department, fire department. If it's in a historic district, what you have to do for the structure within those districts. We modeled it after Evanston's. They have a very good guide as well. I think Evanston has been very successful in their attempt to advertise ADU units. I think we probably need to do a little bit more in the community, put it in our newsletter, put a little bit more on our website to make sure everybody knows that it's available there. One of the other things I wanted to quickly mention was that our ADUs have to be, you either have to be owner occupied in the main house or in the ADU. And that Airbnbs are actually allowed in an ADU if you want to do that, but you have to register with the village. We have a new registration program for Airbnbs. And they are taxed and regulated, but that is a good guide for anybody who's interested in doing ADU in the village.
Fantastic. Thanks, Greg. All right. And Daniel, what is next in the city of Chicago?
Yeah, I mean, I think the major challenge is one that's been mentioned several times, which is just financing, both from, mortgage lending, but also, public support. I mean, so we passed with the initial ordinance of ADU grant program for low and moderate income homeowners. We have 19 folks who are sort of somewhere in the pipeline of that program. But I think, what we're seeing is that gives up to $75,000, and that's not necessarily going to cover everything, especially for folks who really don't have much, liquid cash that they can throw at that, right? So, that's something that we're still definitely working on. I think, one of the other things is, I didn't mention this, but the south, southeast, and west pilot zones have some slightly different rules from the north and northwest ones that were really the result of conversations with folks in those communities about just the fact that those, very different market conditions in those areas there aren't the same types of affordability pressures. And so for example, there we don't have in the north and northwest pilot zones, there are no owner occupancy requirements, because I think the general feeling was, look, we need more of these units, and we're not going to restrict them to just owner occupants. On the south and southwest sides, or south and west sides, what we heard was, look, we actually have a fair amount of like moderate cost rental housing. We're more interested in targeting this at, homeowners who are trying to do one of the things that we talked about. And, we talked about the differences in the number of applications or approved applications. We have gotten a bunch of applications from non-owner occupied buildings that we've had to say no to the people on the south and west sides, right? And so part of that is obviously, part of the disparity in those numbers is obviously the financing issue. Part of it is also the design of the program and intentionally not allowing some types of ADUs in those areas. And so, that's obviously something that we'll have to talk more with the folks in those communities to see, like, is that trade-off something that we want to continue, or do we want to try to, turn the dial a little bit and see, if another balance is the right one.
Great. Yeah, so obviously a lot of moving pieces here. We're just going to open it up for questions. Yeah, right here.
And really quick, pardon the interruption. You all have microphones on your tables, so when you're asking questions, we just ask if you can speak into the microphone so we can capture your sound. Thanks, sorry about that, Jake.
Hit the, yeah, there you go.
Right, I got it. This is a question for Daniel Hertz. Daniel, two big questions. The obvious one, maybe you could tap away a little bit more on, is there a possibility of this opening up to more of the city or all of the city? And what do you see kind of in your headlights right now? The second one is, you are appointing someone who will be an ADU leader. I'm curious who that might be, or how that process is going and when it might be resolved. So two questions. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. So on the first one, I learned long ago not to make predictions about what council will or will not do. But I feel confident that there will be a significant expansion or citywide expansion at some point in the near future. We've heard now 2 years in a row, we do budget hearings every year where we have to go in front of council and basically answer all of their questions about anything. And 2 years in a row, there have been many aldermen who have said, we need to make this citywide. There's now multiple ordinances sitting in council to expand either citywide or to particular parts of the city. So I think we're going to get there. It's just, the last 6 months, people in City Hall have been a little distracted by first the budget season and then the election, obviously. So I think we'll be engaged this summer and we'll see where things land. And obviously there's still a lot of question marks about who is actually going to be in those seats. For the second question, yeah, I am very excited. We got approved in the budget this year, an additional staffer on my team on the policy bureau at DOH, who a significant chunk of their work will be making the ADU ordinance work better, which is great because when this was initially passed, there was no staffing provided. There was no additional sort of capacity provided. And like I said, we knew before and we know even better now, you can't just open the door and expect everything to go great. So we'll have, hopefully by the summer, city hiring timelines being what they are, someone who, can dedicate a significant portion of their time to doing engagement, to talking to community members, to architects, to homeowners about, how can this work better and, what do we need to be doing to help support the program?
Great. Yes.
So hello, I have a question about energy efficiency and the ETC code for all of these new bills and how that'll play into your ordinances, and that's for everyone in your town, because I know that the source code is going to change this year, actually, and training for the new source code and building codes are going to happen this year.
All right. Who wants to talk about building codes?
I'll start. The Village of Oak Park is actually looking at updating our building codes with the energy efficient caveats. We're looking at the stretch code, which I know won't be done till the end of the year, but MENA, which is a group, energy efficiency group we're working with, is providing us with more information about all electric buildings, and we just did a sustainability plan for the village. So all those things are kind of rolling forward into what we hope will be our revised building code. So all of these offerings will be applicable to those codes once they're in place. But we are looking at a lot more energy efficiency within the village.
Oh, yeah, that's definitely the name of the game. I think we've got time for one or two more, maybe. Kyle? I saw the hand go up fast.
Well, I was really happy that Craig from Oak Park brought up property taxes. And I'm wondering, this is a question I think for either Oak Park or Chicago, if you've been able to quantify the property tax increase, like in a dollar amount for a property adding an ADU, because I've heard that question come up in other communities, and I honestly, I've never heard an answer to it.
You may not get one now, but yeah, I think our ADUs it's too young at this point to really have a full understanding of what the impact is. So I think, this is really the first year that we've started to monitor them. So I think maybe in a year or two, we'll have a better understanding of what the impact is going to be.
All right, one more question. Yes.
Okay, my question is for Daniel. Good to see you. When Communities United first heard about ADUs, we got very excited because we have been pushing for the preservation of the 2 to 4 flat for many, many years. And we saw the ADUs as a time for us to really get into the basements of our 2 to 4 flats, knowing what we've been seeing. They're rented, right? Because we do a lot of boots on the ground organizing, and the landlord has their basement unit rented at a lower rate because they know that that basement unit might not be safe or healthy. We also know from talking to the people that were renting in these basement units, that if it weren't for the rents that they're paying, the low rents that they're paying, they would be homeless. And this is what they were telling us. So when we started talking and hearing about ADUs, we thought this would be a way to work with the city to get in there, fix the basement unit, make sure the family isn't displaced, and have a good, safe, healthy unit for that family to live in. So somehow that discussion got off the map, right? But we still were excited because we thought that these units were going to be affordable. And if you look at the data, most of the units that are the AD units that are being made now are in the wealthiest parts of the city. So who are we building these ADUs for? Are we building them to create more affordable units? No, because that's obvious. There aren't any affordable units coming out of that. So are we making the landlord who is already wealthy, because you have to be wealthy to even think of doing a unit? Some of these units, it costs more than the house is worth. So who are we creating them for? Are we making the landlord wealthier? Or are we creating affordable units for a city that is lacking so many unaffordable units?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple pieces there. I think the first thing you're talking about the existing informal units, I think you're right, is a problem that we haven't been able to figure out. We haven't been able to successfully address with this program yet, because there's a couple issues. One is motivating the owner of that building to actually, if they feel like they have a situation that's working for them, how do we, encourage them to fix that up? But then how do we do it, as you said, how do we do it without displacing the person who's already there, right? And essentially, I mean, that really needs to be not just a change to the zoning code, which is primarily what, the ADU program is, but, a proactive, building upgrade and, there need a funded program, right? To both create a place for that tenant to go, but also, help pay for the upgrade to the property. On the other piece about the affordability, I don't totally agree about that. This is not producing affordable units. I think while most of the units have been built on the north and northwest sides, we know, there hasn't been a full survey. I mean, first of all, many of these units haven't been actually rented out yet. They're still, because the program is so new. But, we know that basement units in those neighborhoods rent for much less than, other types of units in those places, right? So they are, whether or not they're deeply affordable, they're creating, they're expanding the breadth of price points, on the block or in the community where they exist. And we have seen, because the Chicago ordinance requires, if you're building more than one ADU, requires a legally restricted affordable unit for basically every other unit. There have been a couple dozen legally restricted affordable units that have come out of the program. And then the last thing on the on the landlord side, the other thing is we've seen is about 40% of our ADU applications have been by homeowners, right? And so we've seen a very substantial number of those. People are not landlords, or they're not like large landlords. They're homeowners. But I will say, I think your question is totally correct that like the ADU ordinance on its own is not a comprehensive solution to the sort of affordability or displacement questions that you're asking. One thing I wanted to bring up, and I know we're coming to the end, but
Yes, we are.
I'll close out by saying, I did want to mention that, while we see the ADU ordinance as a way of preserving sort of low and moderate cost housing and creating more low and moderate cost housing in 2 to 6 unit buildings, especially, there are other policies that we've been putting into place that I think do the same thing and are necessary for a broader sort of perspective. So the anti-deconversion policy, the demolition surcharge policy that we've seen in the 606 and Pilsen areas are really meant to be complementary to the ADU program. So I'll just end with that.
Thank you so much. So let's give a warm round of applause to our panel. A few housekeeping announcements, and I'm sorry we had to cut the conversation short, but my duty, like I said, I'm your cruise ship director, and if I let the boat just keep going left, then we'll miss our destination. So we have to stay on course. We are going to take what was 10 minutes and now is 7 bio break, where you can grab some coffee, some snacks to the back. Bathrooms are out to your left. Did I say that right, Emily? Yes. Bathrooms are out to the left. And for those of you who are like, oh my goodness, I want to keep this conversation going, and I knew I should have invited my whole team, we are recording, and this will be available for you to share and share often, and then you can have your own ADU discussion at your office. Use the QR code on your agenda. That is the resource page. It also has a copy of today's agenda, as well as some other really important tools and resources that are that you can couple from today's discussion. But before that, I just want to say thank you again to our fearless group of of ADU supporters, Dan, Craig, Curtis, and of course, Jake. Thank you so much. We'll see you back at 10:30 sharp. And a shout out to Diane for asking us a very intense question, and then we had to close conversation out. So this is all the more reason to stick around during lunch so we can keep the conversations going. And speaking of keeping the conversation going, we talked about the policy, political, how do we get everyone onboarded and socialized to the idea? So now we're going to talk about some fun stuff, the design and construction. I've got some construction folks in the house who I'm sure will appreciate this next topic, as all of us I'm sure will as well. Without further ado though, I'd like to introduce our panel moderator. All the panelists are here, very good. Catherine Darnstadt is an architect and founder of Latent Design, an award-winning urban design practice at the intersection of architecture and community development, creating social, economic, and environmental impact beyond the building. That's pretty cool. Leveraging design as a tool to make the invisible forces impacting a project visible through architecture. The firm's collaborations range from small-scale tactical interventions, new construction community buildings, adaptive reuse, neighborhood master plans, and design speculations throughout the Midwest. Catherine has been featured and published nationally, so she's popular, everyone. You have to look her up. As an American Institute of Architects Young Architects Honor Award, congratulations, the Crain's Chicago 40 Under 40, and the Venice now I'm gonna say this hopefully right, biennial, I learned a new word today, everybody, yay, and previously taught at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and Northwestern University. So she's smart, popular, and is about to drop some really cool wisdom on you with the panel. Welcome, everybody. Let's give a warm round.
Thank you for that introduction and morning, everyone. In addition to that, I'm also very sleepy because I do a lot of things. One of them is going to be talking with this great panel here today to take all of that policy discussion and how are we manifesting that into practice. And so how I want to open up so you get to meet these amazing people and where their perspective on ADUs is. We'll start with an opening question is, who are you? What do you do? And what's your first question you ask to a potential someone interested in ADUs, whether they're a client, a contractor, a partner, Nicole, let's start with you. Who are you? What do you do? And what's your first question out of your mouth?
My name is Nicole. I am in the arts and entertainment business for a long time here in Chicago and actually went to the School of the Art Institute. I have been I have a background in some design, construction, that sort of thing. And that's what sort of prompted me to take on the project of building my own freestanding ADU. When I found out about the program in February of 2021. And I started a website to document the process. And so I've actually had quite a few people approach me and ask me questions about how to get these things started. Most of them have been people who are in similar situation as me. They are property owners. Maybe they want to be their own GC, which is what I approached the project with. And for the most part, those people are asking me, they're standing there, you know, hat in hand saying, is it possible for me to do this on my own? And depending on the time of the day and the part of the process I was in, it may have taken longer or shorter for me to answer that, yes, it is possible for you to create this thing and learn these skills and develop this opportunity for affordable housing in Chicago, which is the important part.
Yeah, and I think that's probably every project's question you ask back is like, are you sure?
Yeah.
You want to go through this? Russell, from your perspective, who are you? What's your perspective? And, you know, what's your first question?
Sure. Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Russ Ryden. I'm with CMHDC. We are a large nonprofit affordable housing provider. We have properties throughout the city of Chicago and also a little bit into the suburbs in Evanston and Cicero. We have a lot of buildings that are kind of your typical walk-up type properties. So these are our properties, many of which have garden units or have storage space or something that can be converted. There's never been a real good opportunity until recently to do that, but we have, I think our portfolio, we've got about 700 units total and maybe 30 or something different buildings, and a lot of those buildings have potential in them. The project we're going to talk about is a mixed use building where we converted retail space into housing units, affordable housing units. But my question is kind of the same: is, are you ready for it? It's a big undertaking. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of money. And you got to be prepared for that. I mean, that's the question I have back is just, are you ready? Are you ready for it? Where you got to go through.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then Robbie, yourself?
Hello there, everyone. Great to be here with you all this morning. Robbie Marcus. I'm a worker owner, as we say, and the general manager of Evanston Development Cooperative. We are a worker-owned cooperative focused on designing and building inclusive, resilient neighborhoods. So we've been around for around 4 years at this point, got incorporated in 2018, and we spent several years working quite closely with the city of Evanston staff on their accessory dwelling unit ordinance. Worked with them on that accessory dwelling unit guidebook, which was supported by AARP, and are a design builder of all electric new construction accessory dwelling units mostly. With prefabricated structural insulated panels. So to Catherine's question of sort of what question do we ask, it's when we get a call from someone who's interested in ADU, it's always, why are you taking on this project? Because as Swasti sort of pointed out, there are many reasons why people choose to do this, and that initial answer to that question affects everything from design to budget to site planning and so on and so forth.
Thanks, Robbie. And finally, Monica, introduce yourself and what's your first question?
I have lots of first questions, but I'll start with an introduction. So Monica Chata, founder and principal of Civic Projects Architecture. Our work ranges from nonprofit community centers through to education spaces, through to museums, through to a lot of multifamily housing. So we're founded around civic engagement and community outreach to actually define our projects. And we are also developer, owner, property manager, and GC for a lot of multifamily units. So I'll be wearing a couple of hats in this conversation. All of that means it's incredibly complicated. But my first question, particularly because most of the calls we get are City of Chicago, is where do you live? So I can look up the ward to tell you the sad story that you're not in the it is difficult to explain that to people. It's like, you've heard about this thing, but you're not in the pilot. And then my second question is usually, what's the exact address, so we can go through zoning and other criteria. So it's not fun to lose a client before you've even had the conversation, but I really don't want people pursuing things that aren't viable in that moment.
Yeah, that makes a good point. And, another piece of advocacy of why the pilot program areas should expand across Chicagoland, to make that more accessible. And I think to both Monica and to Nicole, you both mentioned you're wearing a lot of hats. Like Monica, you have a lot of hats that you're wearing through your different companies that you have. And then through Nicole, you wore a lot of hats just building your own coach house for yourself. And so starting with Monica, how do you know, like, how do you know your role on a particular project? Where are you coming in as an architect versus as a homeowner or a developer because you have both coach house and basement ADU conversion. So how do you know what's the right role and kind of where do your perspectives narrow or expand based on a project?
So I'm an architect first, I think is where I would define stuff. So we use that knowledge either through defining the viability of the project or actually doing the design, the construction drawings of the project. I have the benefit of, so I'm owner of the architecture firm. My husband and I are co-developer, and then he actually wears the hat of GC. So complicated, but it actually helps us. Like, so what we're able to do is the 360, return existing structures to productive use. That's fundamentally what we're trying to do. And in terms of the hats, honestly, it depends on kind of where we are in the process, because we have to identify the project, then look at its viability and feasibility, and then actually execute the project. A lot of partners that we've worked with are in the room, CIC being a really essential partner for us in the work that we do. And because our stuff is primarily South Side, we're returning buildings to productive use in really under-resourced areas. So the viability and the ability, and I know some of your other questions might get into sort of cost and feasibility of doing these, but it starts with the building, because almost all of our multifamily is returning housing to productive use and abandoned buildings to productive use.
And then for Nicole, where you built your own coach house, and was the intent when you started this project? I know you're representing a homeowner's perspective that isn't necessarily the majority in the audience, but what drove this project and how did you end up laying all the tile for it?
Yeah, I mean, it was a simple thought initially in February of 2021. I needed a new garage. And so I started looking through those options, discovered the ADU ordinance was close to passing, and being in the arts and entertainment business, February of 2021, I had a lot of time on my hands. And so I took that opportunity and sort of my stored up energy and creativity and dug into my community to help me find people to help me address certain situations, certain aspects of it. And then from there, I just sort of started putting one foot in front of the other, which is how anything in life gets done. Just one foot in front of the other. You come across things where you stumble, pick yourself up, dust yourself off, keep going. And yeah, the intent was to create a big, beautiful brick building that was hopefully in 10 years will be indistinguishable from my front two flat.
Thank you for that. And some photos are scrolling behind of the projects and Nicole on some scaffolding just for verification.
Yes.
What she's saying is true.
I promise.
And so Robbie, I'm sure that's not how you open up conversations when you're working through projects with clients. It's like, we'll build 75% of it, you build the other 25. In your intro, you talked about how Evanston Development Corporation, really focuses on all electric, and then through, your construction typology with SIPs. Can you explain some of the benefits that you're realizing through, being a little bit ahead of the curve, both on all electric and then, with your construction types?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a climate crisis in the 21st century. And so we're trying to think about how we can address that on new construction projects. I mean, I recognize the carbon emissions that come from just transport in terms of getting materials to the site. But yeah, what we really do through framing the house is build an extremely energy efficient structure through structural insulated panels. So this video that's coming up is an affordable ADU that we finished that's restricted at 60% AMI in partnership with the city of Evanston. So it was a really tight lot in terms of width. So we did have to build the apartment on the second floor, but it's a 2-bedroom household, and the public schools in Evanston are fantastic. So the goal with the city was to make it big enough for a small family to be able to live there. And it was built with SIPs. So, you know, we learned from this project. We built it with batted insulation. In retrospect, I think we're now learning we want to do closed cell insulation to really get a tighter building. But still the blower door test came in below 3.0 ACH, 2.52 ACH 50. So especially for affordable housing, that's an extremely airtight structure. And that just means you need less energy to heat and cool the building.
Thank you for that. We love seeing buildings get built in 30 seconds or less. It's my favorite part of the job, managing expectations. Russell, you're working, you know, with existing buildings and the transformation of, you know, currently some atypical spaces. You're going from commercial to residential and different situations like that. Can you explain a little bit more what your process is and how are you making it financially feasible for your organization to undertake some of these conversions?
Sure. So I guess our process is, when we look at our existing portfolio, do we have opportunities in basements or something? Is there room? And we do have some buildings that do have that. The building, I don't know if we have a slide of my project, but yeah, so our project, this is 91st and Beverly, so south side, but this was done all pre-ADU. We typically don't own commercial space. We're affordable apartment owners. This building was a fantastic building that just happened to have some commercial space when we bought it, and basically was vacant for almost 20 years. This is next to a metro stop, but unfortunately, this is the only commercial in the area. This is all single family homes, kind of a very quiet, very stable neighborhood. We love the neighborhood, but not a good commercial area. So our commercial spaces never got leased, or if they did get leased, it just, you know, lasted a year and then they were gone. So not very viable. So a few years ago, we finally said, all right, well, there was early talk of the ADU, and we said, maybe this is the time to start looking at it. We had to go through the full process, zoning, permits, everything. We didn't have the benefit of really anything at that time. So it was kind of a painful and long process. But for us, we couldn't add additional affordable units in that particular neighborhood any other way. There's no other space. There's no other buildings available. There's no other multifamily buildings in that particular little pocket. So this was really the only way we could add units in this area we liked, and do so, you know, hopefully at a cost point that wasn't too bad. And we were able to bring it to, you know, a cost point that was okay for us, but from our standpoint, this was 7 units that we created. It was just under $1 million in total costs. So it was pretty substantial. We happen to be fortunate and have capital, have lines of credit, and have a lot of great banking partners that we work with, including CIC and Bank Financial, a couple others. So we were able to do this, but it was a big undertaking and quite expensive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And you have, for your organization, you kind of have a number that works for these conversions. Monica, for you, when you're kind of coming in as an architect, throughout the last, since the ADU pilot program launch, have you been changing anything in terms of your designs or recommendations to kind of manage budgets on ADU conversions?
So during the break, we were talking about budgets. They're not cheaper to build, and in a lot of cases they're more expensive. So I think that's another managing expectations and conversation. particular with the escalated costs that we're seeing through the pandemic, but we want to work to build more affordable rental. Garden units, coach houses make sense, but they're not any cheaper to build. So I'm kind of I'm circling around the question, but that's been a challenge that's continually posed to us. And then that balance between what you need to add to legalize these units, it's hard, right? Like if we come in as architects, we're going to tell you whether or not it meets code. We're going to tell you whether you've got legal exits. We're going to tell you what we need. The changes in city code now talk about triggering sprinkler requirements when you add units to the basement. So you're talking about all these layers. And so we're very early stages. We'd rather sit down and sort of talk and walk through all of these steps, because once you put the sprinklers, add the exiting, do the modifications, like I can't make you an ADU cheaper than it would cost to renovate. So if you have a 6 flat, there's the conversation of if that's developer owned, adding 2 units to add to the housing stock. But then as an individual, because there was a comment, I think earlier about non-conforming or illegal basement units, and there's a very challenging cost to building owners, homeowners who want to absolutely do the right thing by every intention, but then are struggling to manage those costs.
Yeah.
There's a lot of units and situations where people honestly just don't know they're non-conforming units because they've bought buildings or homes with garden units that they're just not aware whether that was done legally or illegally.
Right, right. Because it pre-existed their current ownership.
Yeah, it's like, I bought it, it was there.
Right.
Can there be anything wrong with it?
Right, exactly. And
Um,
do you see, for you, Robbie, do you see that happening? Most of your projects, I think, are in Evanston. Are you seeing some of the same kind of code conversion concerns, like when you're working through an existing unit? And then, how are you managing costs?
Yeah, so on the code and conversion item, we haven't run into it directly, though, in our policy work. We're just hearing about it. I mean, I was just talking with a small multifamily landlord in Evanston who bought an existing duplex and the basement had been rented out. It wasn't a compliant accessory dwelling unit. And yeah, the city came in on it, and he's got to work on making it a compliant ADU. And I think it's mostly there, but it's not a compliant ADU under code. From a budget perspective, I think we're in the same boat as the person at Oak Park communicated in terms of what types of construction we're seeing in Evanston. They're mostly the detached ADUs, which from a budget perspective are the most expensive ones to build. And I think part of that is an awareness thing that most people don't realize. You can convert your garage, that you can build something that's connected to the garage, that you can, build an attachment to the existing house if you have the lot coverage and impervious surface coverage for it. There are a lot of different options that maybe have different price points. And I still think a lot of people in Evanston, and I can't speak to Chicago, just when they think of this, just think of something in the backyard that's separate from the main house. And so I think in terms of education and awareness that there are different types of projects you can take on that have different price points would go a long way in terms of the budget discussion. Because I know in LA, there are a lot of permits being pulled on the garage conversions.
Thank you for that. So that's one kind of lesson we could, Chicago folks can learn from Evanston or the surrounding suburbs, is just looking at different conversion options. And maybe that's a recommendation to think of for future iterations of not only ADU or coach house code, but like increased accessibility, as was mentioned on the previous panel. Is like, we can't make an accessible ground floor ADU if it's a coach house, right? Because of our parking requirements within single family homes. So all of that starts to tie together. Nicole, for your question, since we're talking a little bit about money and the financing and all that, how did this all come together for you? Like, as a homeowner, where did your financing come from? Did you go out for a loan? Did people look at you cross-eyed when you were asking for, telling them what you were going to do and how you were going to pay for it?
Yeah, I stopped telling them what I was going to do.
It was just a general home renovation at
Yeah,
that point.
because, 81, there's a lot of that. And yeah, I approached 5 different banks and was rejected 5 different times. And I was just looking for a refi on my 2-flat that I'd owned for 6 years and done a lot of work inside. And then I connected with, actually, if anybody has listened to the WGN show that's hosted by David Hochberg. Anybody? Yeah, he's a card. But he has a show and he talks about, you know, home purchases and that sort of thing. And I reached out to him and he connected me with somebody who was able to provide me with the refi. And then I had another situation where I had partnered with some people during the pandemic and started a small business that was a virtual events and entertainment. And so I got some money out of that situation. And then I just squeezed my pennies until, you know, Abe Lincoln shed a tear. And took every opportunity I could. I you know, bartered with people I knew, people in my community. I learned skills and trades. I am now technically a finished carpenter. How do you do? Anything that the city would allow a non-city certified contractor to do, I took on. Yeah, but it was possible. It was doable.
Yeah. Russell, from your end, from financing, you mentioned you have some partners in the room. CIC has been named a couple times on these projects, but have you had any difficulties at a larger scale trying to secure financing for some of these conversions, knowing they're a little bit higher than average?
No, but I can just say because we're, you know, we've got a lot of lending partners and we're fairly well capitalized, but it's tough. I mean, it's tough to, you know, they're expensive, and working within the existing buildings, like they said, sometimes is more expensive. So that's a challenge, but we've been fortunate in that we've been able to work with our banking partners and been able to raise the money to be able to do it, but we're doing it a little bit, I guess, bigger scale in some ways. So
Monica, I saw you move the mic, so I know you're going to say something.
Well, I just wanted to add, because I think this is something that was mentioned earlier this morning. So all our work is not city subsidized. There's no tip finding. There's no nothing. This is similar to you. It's a challenge to kind of put those buckets together. It's part of why we're GC for our own projects. But I think we have to find a way to make this able to be constructed where it's not relying on subsidy, because otherwise we're not creating we're not self-perpetuating, right? It's like, oh, well, if the city doesn't have money, I'm not going to be able to build these affordable units. Well, that's a problem. So I see kind of lots of nods, but I think that's something all of us are encountering in different ways.
Agreed. It's the same on our projects where we had one coach house. One of our first coach houses was in the South Pilot Zone, owner occupied, fit all the narrow requirements that are in the South and the West sides to do a coach house, couldn't get the financing for it. Our one that's broke ground after 8 months of permitting, if anyone's from DOB, these narrow eyes are for you. That one's going up on the North Pilot Zone. And then, you know, the variety of basement units, to Monica's point, it's, you know, some of them are just dead in the water before you even get off the phone call, because, you know, there's a lot of restrictions to that. To leave time for Q&A, I'll have a closing question. I'll start with you, Monica. From your perspective, I think you touched on a couple of these, but what incremental solutions can you recommend moving forward to increase not only ADU occurrences, but also make, you know, this a better program overall?
So I think I'll throw 2 things into the hat. So this has got to stop being a pilot and has to be citywide. I don't know that there's too many people who would disagree. The inequitable distribution of it right now is a problem. Along those lines, I actually think we have to expand some of the requirements, because we are not owner occupied in the way others are. And I understand a lot of the parameters around it, but if someone has a 4, 6, 8 unit and can provide 2 additional units in the basement, I don't know that has to be restricted by owner occupied, but if some of the restrictions are modified and the areas in which you can build them are expanded, I think that would go a long way to increasing the numbers we're seeing right
Yeah.
now.
Agreed. Robbie, from your perspective?
Aside from financing reform at the national level, which is maybe outside of our scope today, right now, something we're working on in Evanston is pre-approved template plans. So this is something we've been talking with, especially the city of Seattle about, because they've rolled out a really great program on it. You know, they've said it only accounts for about 10% of their ADU permits that are being pulled, but you know, the goal is to reduce design fees and not start custom, right? So reduce the time that it takes to design a unit and just make design more accessible, especially to moderate income homeowners that are trying to figure out how to start this project and figure out which way is up. Also have some conversations with the Building and Inspection Services Division, which we're doing about what parts of an ADU could be pre-approved in the permit review process. And what we've learned from the city of Seattle is, you know, if we can get like the foundation detail and the framing plans and the house to stay the same every time, that could be pre-approved, but the zoning is going to be different every time, right? The site's going to be different, utilities are going to be different. And so even with a pre-approved unit, we're still going to need zoning review, but maybe there are aspects that could be streamlined.
Thank you for that. Good notes. Russell?
I would agree with what they said. I think that the key is really peeling back those restrictions and opening up the entire city. If it's outside the city, obviously you want suburban areas that are cooperative too. But I think really getting rid of a lot of those restrictions, the owner occupancy, I think that doesn't make sense in a lot of circumstances. Things like that to make it easier. Our project, I think we spent over 8 months in permits and zoning. You know, expediting that kind of thing would be fantastic. But yeah, I think standardization and opening up it more would be great.
Hey, Nicole?
I started this process really early after the ordinance was passed. And there was so much confusion and lack of clarity and lack of transparency in the Department of Buildings. And in fact, as I was going, after I had been approved, I was approached a number of times with DOB coming back to me and saying, oh, but we forgot that this needed to be taken care of, or this needed to be taken care of. And that threw a wrench in not only the process, but also the confidence to create it. Of course, you know, in terms of the affordability of it, the funding, the streamlining of the process are all really important, but also having really clear guidelines, transparency, so that it's something that both the designer I worked with and the expediter and myself would all be able to approach it in a much more sort of calm and fleshed out fashion.
Yeah. Okay. And with that, in our last like 10, 12 minutes or so, if you have a question for the panel, please raise your hand. I'll call on you. You know, you have the mic at your table, and tell us who it's directed to on the panel. Yes.
So my question is kind of a bridge between the previous panel and this panel. We have worked in adding units in Oak Park, Evanston, Bensonville, and Chicago, so we've kind of seen it across the board. And a lot of the questions we have is how much is this going to cost up front, which is very hard to tell people. But I think having something where we can add into all of the guidelines on, you know, when does electrical need to be changed? Because usually it's 99% of the time. When does water service need to be changed? Also 99% of the time. And coordinating it between the front building changes and the rear building changes, I think needs to be addressed very early on, even on a document formulating anything with zoning. I think that will really help homeowners and developers know what the cost is going to be.
So I guess, does anyone on the panel want to answer the comment? Yeah, you know, it's a good suggestion, because I think I do have a question to that. In Chicago, we have like for homeowners, they have, when do you need a permit and when do you don't need a permit? It's a very simple bullet point on the website. Can we do something similar? Because you can't advocate, you can't say it's gonna cost you 10 grand for this. Like the city, we know they can't give specifics, but can they give, when is this needed versus when is not for ADUs or any types of conversions? I know for the previous panel, I don't know if Oak Park or Bensenville does something similar in general. But I think Monica, you wanted to answer that.
Yeah, I think you're actually raising a good point, because even though we can't necessarily talk to the exact costs, the fact that these are the considerations, right?
Mhm.
You may need new water service. Yes, I would almost argue 100% of the
Yeah.
time. Electrical, if you're, if you're not under a certain capacity, but I actually think guidelines and templates that are developed for the city of Chicago need to actually include this much more so than a patterning of the architecture. And I have to say that because we often think that, oh, if I've got the template, then I can go. Well, architects are not your most expensive thing, right? Like you can pay an architect for a fraction of the cost. You can do new water service or new electrical. So it's allow the space to design and make it unique to you. But if we could just start like almost like a checklist of like, here are the 5 things you should check before you even start, right? Maybe we're not saying how much, but like imagine if you just had here are 6 things to consider.
Right.
Yeah, that would have been absolutely game changing, for sure.
And that goes to the comments around transparency, standardization, and a general awareness. We have the zoning side, we have the building department side, we have the building inspector side. Not all of them know what's going on, a project, or especially a new code, which is only 2-3 years old. It's new. It's going to be new to somebody for the next decade, right? And we have to kind of help standardization both externally and internally. Other questions that people have for the panelists? They're very nice. Don't be shy. Yes.
Yes, my question is for Russell. Russell, out of the 7 units that were created from commercial space, what were the bedroom size?
There is 5 1-bedrooms, a 2-bedroom, and a studio, I believe.
Okay, and what were the rents? What are the rents on there?
They're all, I don't know specifically, I can't tell you exactly what they are, but they're all within 80% of median income. That's our mission. So and we've got a couple accessible units that we were able to build there too.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Curtis?
Yeah, I think Monica mentioned it, but I had a thought, and maybe there's some others that would be able to comment on it, but I think you had mentioned people coming to you and you basically, one of the initial conversations is, are you even in the pilot area? How do we get that information back to either the alders or the departments? People searching Cityscape, Chicago Cityscape, that are realizing that they can't do it. I mean, half the battle is we're not, I guess Daniel was mentioning it earlier, like we need to know that there's people interested in this outside of the pilot areas. How do we trickle that information back up so we can actually get rid of these, the pilots, so make it citywide?
I do think, I like that you mentioned Cityscape. There are a few resources that need to be made more, like awareness, right? Know that they're out there, because an example like that, you could actually like, here is my address. What can I do? Oh, it's not in the pilot. But if there was a way maybe to start collecting that the data goes back, the part of the issue is different. This was mentioned earlier, but different aldermen have different opinions on this. I literally don't know how you change City Hall, because that's kind of what this would take, right? But if there are resources like looking at ULI, looking at CIC, like if there's others that can help collect, I think that you would find that pretty much all of this audience and many others would be happy to share the information.
Something I've seen in the state of California, where, very progressive ADU legislation meets venture capital in Silicon Valley, is I know there's one startup that's doing software as a service to municipal governments focused on like an online ADU portal. You plug in your address and it tells you, are you able to do this? What zoning district are you, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not saying the private sector should solve this problem, but I am saying that, more accessible public tools for people to understand, can I do this? I think are very useful.
I would love to see the alderman's offices have somebody who has information and knowledge and like have that be a first step, because they are supposed to be, they're there to be our community connection. And they are intended to be our connection to the city of Chicago. And even now, as I field inquiries through people that I know or my website or whatever the case is, they will approach their alderman's office. The aldermen have little to no information about it, and they should, in my opinion, be charged with collecting that information and disseminating it back.
So I think Daniel, I don't know where he moved to, but I think this is all becomes some of the first tasks for your ADU hire, because you're hearing right here what people are looking for in the first questions to ask. There is a question over here.
Yeah, so sort of in the spirit of the streamlining and affordability, is there a world where modular fits in to this policy?
Do you want to start with this answer?
We've never done modular. So I'm not too familiar with the code and where the state's at around modular construction. What we're doing right now is prefab, and even with that, you know, there's still sort of some back and forth and different perspectives that we're seeing in the city of Evanston on quote unquote how prefab or modular you can go. Like our panel manufacturer will let us run, you know, they'll run conduit through the walls and ship it to us on site, but the city won't allow that.
Yeah.
So those are the types of things that we're seeing as we try to implement those types of technologies. Yeah.
And I think we've worked on modular before and prefab, and I think, yes, it's allowed in Chicago. There's a couple great modular companies in the city who are working through it. I think with ADUs specifically and coach houses specifically, sorry, it's can you actually get the module to the backyard?
Yeah.
So there's a logistical issue that I think stops it. So where prefab makes more sense, I mean, at least in the city of Chicago, you have narrow alleys, there a rat's nest of wires behind there. You have to crane it over a primary building on the lot. And that's just a logistical issue that maybe is solved by just carrying it instead, you know? So,
yeah, we've on one project, we did SIP roof panels. On others, we've just done a conventional roof and SIP wall panels. And to Catherine's point, yeah, SIP roof panels in an alley, and it was it was a learning process. Yeah, there are site access issues. Yeah.
The captain's here, so does this mean one last question?
So this is a general question for all of you, and I guess the whole room in general, but if homeownership is America's way to build wealth, how do we use ADUs to increase wealth for communities of color while not increasing the wealth gap by the people having access to financing our homeowners already? Just
quick question. Yeah.
That's only going to take the same amount of time that speed build.
Anyone on the panel want to start? I think it's a good lunch question too. It's like when we have more time for that.
I mean, it's got to be financing reform. I've seen self-help do some interesting work on the West Coast around piloting a mortgage product with an intentional focus on working with homeowners of color. I was on another ADU panel with Next City with this Keys to Equity program that Chan Zuckerberg Initiative's getting behind. And they're doing some really interesting work around this pilot in Oakland, focusing on intentionally addressing the racial wealth gap as a way by having the ADU be a rental income stream for an income qualifying homeowner. You know, they're piloting a mortgage product, which, you know, the two big issues around ADU financing, I think there's a financing panel coming up, but
yeah.
I think that's, oh, go ahead. Thank you. Go ahead. Thank you very much. No, I think that's a beautiful stopping point so that we can transition into that next panel. So see, you kind of forecasted and we didn't even plan that. See? Yes. Before we go, I want us to give another round of applause to Monica, Robinson, Russell, Nicole, and our very awesome Catherine for your
powerhouse moderating skills. This was a great panel. Thank you so much, everyone. All right, onward and upward. If our financing and resource panel can make their way to the table, I will introduce our moderator. I have the pleasure of not only working with, but introducing Emily Bloom Carlin, who I'm sure after today is going to take one of the longest naps on the planet because her life has been consumed with all things ADU. And isn't this a beautiful event that she really piloted today? Please, y'all gotta give her more energy than that. Now, come on, there we go. Emily Bloom Carlin is a senior program officer at the Preservation Compact. A substantial focus of Emily's work at the Compact is developing policies, tools, and incentives for preserving small and mid-sized rental properties as affordable. Her current portfolio also includes projects related to property tax policy. She is our in-house expert, equitable pandemic recovery, and accessory dwelling units, hence why we are all gathered here today. Emily was also a member of the ULI ADU Task Force, and prior to joining the Compact in 2017, Emily worked with the Housing Justice Team at the Shriver Center on Poverty Law and at Metro Housing in Boston. But she's also very smart, very collaborative, and one of my favorite conveners because she has a way of bringing together aldermen, public funding organizations, community advocacy groups, and she has this way of creating Switzerland on a Zoom call that you would just not believe. So please give it up for Emily and our next panel on financing and resources.
Hey everyone, I'm so excited to be here today to talk about ADU financing. As we heard from the last panel, ADU projects can be extremely expensive, and as a result, financing and financial supports are a really important part of ensuring equitable access to the benefits of ADUs. Oh, I'm sorry. They're important to financing and financial supports are important, in particular when we're thinking about equitable access to the benefits of ADUs. But, you know, as you've heard from the other panels as well, we're still really in the early stages of talking about ADU financing. So I'm really excited to have this expert panel here who are really at the forefront of thinking about the opportunities and challenges related to financing ADU projects. So we have Roz Meerdink, Senior Loan Officer at Community Investment Corporation. We have Adam Rogers, Managing Director of Community Development at CIBC. We have Donna Clark, Chief Operating Officer at Neighborhood Housing Services of Chicago, and we have Jesse Beyer from Guaranteed Rate. And so I'd really like to start out very sort of at the most basic level, talking about what tools we already have. And so Donna, Adam, Jesse, and Roz, I'd love to start by having each of you sort of talk us through who's your borrower, what kind of building do they own, and which of your loan products or grants are really the best fit for ADU projects. And Jesse, I wonder if you could start us off.
How about now? Okay. By the way, this whole conversation around financing and rehabbing and modifying multi-units and single family homes is like my love language. So I'm in a happy place right now. So my clients are typically homeowners, 1 to 4 units. And while I do regular just forward purchase and refinance, I specialize in renovation financing. So ADUs were brought to my attention probably about a year and a half ago. So I think still pretty early in the process of it being rolled out in the pilot program. But it's a normal conversation for me with folks that are looking to renovate a multi-unit building. And so we have a couple different products, but our FHA product specifically, the renovation one, is used more often than anything else because it has low down payments and other qualifying components to it that are pretty inclusive.
That's wonderful. And Jesse, before we move on to the next person, ADU is such a technical term, and I know that folks in the financing industry don't necessarily use that. So when you're talking about ADUs with your clients, what kind of a project is it? Like literally what space in or on their property?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because in our world, if you are finishing out a basement and you're calling it an ADU, we just would call it another unit. So if it's a 2-unit and you're finishing out a basement, it's now a 3-unit to us. And I think a lot of that stems around there's not a section on the appraisal that would allow us to classify anything related to an ADU, but we do have single family 1 unit, or excuse me, 2 unit, 3 unit, 4 unit. So yeah, so that's
wonderful. That's super, super helpful. I know this is like part of bridging the community development, lending, and planning worlds, is sort of thinking about some of these more technical terms. And so Donna, I'd love to turn to you next. I think a lot of folks are familiar with NHS's lending work, but you were also one of the organizations that helped administer the first round of the Chicago ADU grant program. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the structure of that grant.
Sure, thank you, and thanks for the invite for being here. So, we worked with the city to craft this pilot for the ADU in the city. And so the pilot, the ADU repair grant, aligned with the city's requirements. So it was the, in the pilot areas, the 5 pilot areas, we actually worked really hard with the city to push them on the AMI requirement. So we probably talked a good 6 months. We actually interviewed other community development organizations. We talked to architects, and kind of going in, we knew that the cost was going to be high. So we actually pushed the AMI requirement to 140%, and we actually rolled out with that. The structure of this repair grant was $10,000 to do to work with an architect and to work with or a structural engineer. So we know the folks that were coming in for grants, that was something that they usually any of our other home improvement grants did not pay for, and we knew that this was going to be a requirement of this program. So we set aside money for that. And the only thing is that during that process, then they'll figure out how much this will really cost and whether they want to move forward or not move forward. But we didn't want the grant to be dependent upon them moving forward through this process. So the only thing that they had to do to qualify for this grant was to file those plans with the Department of Buildings. And then if they wanted to move forward, that's why we broke up the grants. Then there was a $75,000 construction grant in addition to that planning grant. The planning, we actually gave them, a year to do the planning, and then obviously, with the construction season being shortened, then they could, roll this program over to, an additional year. We have a construction services team. I think I see Sean in the room who was working on this program as well. And we sent our construction services person out to assess the space because the space that they thought might be good for, an ADU might not really be in compliance, or there might be another space in that was, better space to build this one. And then also, I think what's critical is, remember, in Chicago, 75% of the housing here is 60+ years old. There's a lot of deferred maintenance. And so our team goes out to go, okay, what are some of the other health and safety requirements before we even start talking about, an ADU? So that's just part of the technical service that we provide as part of the grant. And then we allowed that 20% of the construction grant amount be used for health and safety requirements. Our focus was on the single family 1 to 4 unit space. And, and then obviously structures 20 years or older, and it was for owner occupants. And what we've seen is that, a lot of the people coming in are, are Southsiders. I mean, it's spread across the 5 pilot areas. Okay, sorry. So, a lot of the, we focused on owner occupants in the single family 1 to 4 unit space with a repair grant.
Wonderful. And Adam, could you talk to us a little bit about your clients and your products?
Sure. Hi, good morning. CIBC has a housing finance program called the Housing Initiative that provides acquisition and rehabilitation financing to small scale developers to acquire and rehabilitate vacant, foreclosed, and abandoned single family homes that are located in low and moderate income census tracts that will be made available to homeowners upon completion. So to repeat, acquisition, rehabilitation financing for vacant, foreclosed, and abandoned single-family homes in low and moderate income census tracts
that will be made available to homeowners upon completion. And the financing is a 14-month term. The interest rate is prime. There's no origination and no prepayment penalty, and you only pay interest on the money that is drawn, and will advance 50% of the construction financing in order to provide working capital during the construction period of the home. So we're working with small scale developers, the majority of which are doing no more than 2 to 3 homes at any particular time. The majority are actually just doing 1 home at a time. They're picking up properties that are in the middle of blocks in neighborhoods that are otherwise pretty stable, but that might have a few homes here and there that are in need of rehabilitation. And the purpose of the program is to take these blighted homes and get them back into home ownership for the purpose of revitalizing the neighborhood.
Wonderful. And Roz?
Hi, everybody. My name is Roz. I'm a loan officer at CIC. We specialize in the multifamily space, which we consider 5 units and above. We do refinance, acquisition, and rehab lending. And while we don't have any specific products for ADUs, we try to be open to adding ADUs to any of our existing products, our regular multifamily product, as well as some of our more targeted loans, which are sometimes neighborhood specific or building type specific. And we specialize, or we're well known for lending on the south and the west sides, but we do lend throughout the 7 county collar area, and then all over the city.
Perfect. And Roz, before we move into talking about sort of some of the challenges, I'd love to ask you a little bit about what the first panel talked about, right? So I know I like to say to people that zoning changes are necessary but not sufficient, but I'm curious what difference the Chicago pilot ordinance or other regional zoning changes have made in your ability to finance ADUs.
Yeah, so I can't believe people haven't really talked that much about appraisals today. It's probably the focus of what I want to talk about here. We underwrite very closely to the appraisal. And so our ability to underwrite or to raise your loan limit based on that unit that may or may not be legal, may or may not be a conforming ADU is based on how likely the appraiser thinks that and can count that income. So when I talk to appraisers, they're really across the board. Some are totally hesitant, cannot count it. Others are open to it if you provide them with more information about ADUs, about the pilot program specifically. And they're able to underwrite kind of a hypothetical situation. If there was an ADU, if it's legal, what would the rent be and what would the valuation be based on that, the inclusion of that unit? For example, a 6-unit building with 2 garden units. We kind of are able to look at that building more like an 8-unit building and the income that comes with an 8-unit building. And that gives underwriters a little bit more flexibility to kind of advocate for that property in our own committees and things like that, and to feel confident that that building will perform the way that we underwrite it.
That's wonderful. And so now I'd love to move a little bit more into challenges. So what sort of barriers are you seeing and facing as you're trying to work with your clients, as you're trying to develop projects? And Donna, I'd actually love to start with you and have you talk to us a little bit about what you learned sort of working through this first round of the ADU grant program.
So through this first round, the challenge is the cost. And so the cost of these ADUs that are coming in, they're at between $150,000 to $220,000. And these properties that they're trying to build the ADUs in are the same value in the neighborhoods in which we work. The other challenge that we've seen and that we've heard back is just working with architects. These projects aren't a priority, so it's been taking a long time. Obviously, the other challenge is the source of funds. So we rolled out this program, I told you, at 140% AMI, and the city came back with a source of funds that utilizing the community block development grants, which limited it to an 80% AMI limit. So there's just, and everybody coming in who can utilize this grant are over 80% AMI. And, obviously financing has been an issue. So they're actually using their personal savings. And so this, I don't think intention. So kind of those are some of the challenges that have been really truly undermining the success of the program.
Yeah, definitely. Out of curiosity, do you have a sense for sort of where in the income ranges some of the applicants who have applied who haven't qualified fall?
They're falling, between 90 to 130% AMI, as we, figured.
Makes a lot of sense. So I want to kind of open it up to the rest of the panel. What challenges are you seeing? Does anything Donna said resonate with you? Jesse, I don't know if you want to talk about some of those same challenges.
Well, the biggest challenge I face with clients is they don't know where to go to get the information. And for us, we're not allowed to give out contractor information. It's actually forbidden. So I oftentimes will tell them to lean on their real estate agent, lean on people who are already approved with the village or with the city, approved contractors. And so the time in which it takes to get all the information just around who's going to do the work, let alone if they're trying to navigate, the ADU requirements and who allows it, are they in a zone, what's the footprint requirements, all that can be overwhelming. And to what I've heard throughout the day is it ends up being so daunting, they just say, I'm out. And so I think as a collective group, just to try to find a platform where it can make it, I always refer to it as building a bridge. You can stand on one side of the cliff and look over there, like, I'd like to get there. We need to find a way to help build that bridge. They know how to cross it.
So given the target audience of the program, both at the small scale developer level and then the homeowner that's going to purchase the property upon completion, I think one of the challenges is how do you value that square footage on the site and in the building to the ultimate user? And I think in a lot of cases, a fully finished basement that is accessible to the homeowner, as well as a second story that might have been previously an attic that gets dormered out into adding more living space of the single family residence itself, appraises out higher than the addition of another unit. And then you also have issues from the home buyer perspective that there is only a limited pool of potential buyers that actually want to have a separate unit for which they are collecting rent, rather than just having access to the benefit of the fully rehabilitated space for their own personal residence.
And kind of while my fellow panelists are pointing out a lot of the challenges in the single family space, I think in the multifamily space, there's already a lot of capacity, a lot of know-how. A lot of multifamily owners have kind of the liquids, the access to credit, contractor, these kind of things. So I think in the multifamily space, there's a lot of opportunities, and I kind of challenge the group to think about multifamily owners as part of the solution to the problem. They have some of the scale, and certainly if we're trying to expand this to other areas in the city, multifamily owners in the south and west sides are definitely a place to do it. So relaxing some of these restrictions so that multifamily owners can do what they do best. It was great to see Monica's project up here, CMHDC's project up here. These people are both mission driven and for profit, and can be part of the solution here.
And on sort of the underwriting and appraisal question, I wonder, Jesse, if you could talk a little bit about what that process looks like and what sort of challenges around ADUs you've seen through that process.
I'd say the challenge just out of the gate, and it's not ADU specific, is just people don't know that the product exists. There was one of the panelists prior had mentioned she was doing her own project and found Dave Hochberg. You find him because he's on the radio a lot, but I don't even know if his group even does this type of financing. We're a niche group within a big community. And so creating awareness around that this even exists is probably is also a challenge, but also a big part of helping people achieve what they want with these ADUs. As far as the processing and underwriting goes, it works very much like a traditional loan, in the sense that, like I said, the most popular product is going to be our FHA product, but it's not the normal FHA that most people think of. Not to get technical, but it's a 203K, which the K indicates renovation, not B, which is the regular one. And so we look at it similar in regards to the underwrite, income, asset, credit, all those things need to be there. But we're completely different when it comes to the appraisal process. We will get a bid or a write-up from what's called a HUD consultant, and that lays out the scope of work. And then we're gonna give that to the underwriter and the appraiser, and the appraiser's looking at this building now as if the property's already finished. So we don't lend on its current condition. So it could be a foreclosure and vacant, or it could be just, I want to add an ADU or what have you. And what's nice is we don't lend, we lend on the future value. And in some cases, specifically with the FHA product, even if it doesn't dollar for dollar support that future value, we can lend up to 110% of the future value, because we realize some things just aren't going to add as much value as others. And so the appraisal piece is different. And then of course we have to validate the contractor. We want to make sure that whoever's doing the work has done it before, has references, good standing with the state, properly licensed and insured, because once we do close and that money starts to get allocated, it's got to get done right, because we can't reclose it and get more money, right? So that's really the main component. We underwrite the same, it's just the appraisal and the contractor piece that's a little unique.
So I also underwrite to the as rehabilitated value of the property, but I have a 75% loan to value, bright line maximum limit. And since since all of these homes are located in low and moderate income areas, in a lot of cases, there are not the sales comps to support the actual, what turns out to be the actual value of the as rehabilitated property. Over and over and over again, these properties sell for $30,000 to $50,000 more than the upfront appraisal said that they would. And while it's great to be part of the process of establishing the sales comps value in some of these neighborhoods, it can be a challenge when you first go into the neighborhoods because of that bright line lending limit. I also can have challenges from a credit approval perspective if, even though the developer is confident that they can get more for the home upon completion, if it looks like they're going in underwater, that poses a risk for me to demonstrate the ability of the loan to get repaid. Our standards, underwriting standards for this program are actually very low, relatively speaking. We require the developer to have experience completing one comparable previous project, and we're underwriting the real estate itself rather than the personal financials of the developer. That said, there needs to be some evidence or capacity to evidence financial stability. But we're really focused on the economics of the real estate itself and the ability of the developer working with the contractor in order to complete the project, sell it in order for us to get repaid.
Roz, I'm not sure if you have more thoughts on underwriting and appraisers. I know you talked a little bit about that sort of upfront. Yeah, just curious if there's more you'd like to add on that.
Yeah, I think as these projects go through the system and we have more and more examples, everybody will feel more comfortable, the appraisers and the lenders who base their underwriting on those appraisals. So, and then in addition, the pilot area. So we feel so much more comfortable in the pilot area, and the more that we see those examples come through, I think the more we can feel confident as we go to advocate for those projects in our own committees.
And just as sort of a quick lightning round, I do in a second want to move to opportunities, but I'm curious, panel, are there any challenges that you'd like to lift up that you haven't mentioned yet? Whether it's around construction costs, rates, anything you could share?
I mean, interest rates have gone crazy. I was looking, so prime is more than doubled from what it was a year previous. That obviously adds significant costs to the project, and it also significantly reduces the potential pool of buyers upon completion. Hearing the conversation today about the challenges with the city and the permitting process, and, you know, moving and providing access for utilities, if it was a coach house property, these are significant obstacles to the scale of the developers that I am working with, and it poses significant risks for completion. Like, as a lender, when I'm going in, I want to know that you're gonna complete this as quickly as possible, get it sold and get me repaid. We give 14 months. Most developers complete construction in 6 months, and they have a significant cushion for the resale time. But when you start adding these obstacles and challenges, that becomes a challenge for credit approval from a lending perspective.
And I would add that the time, the complexity, and the attorney fees that go into that process make it very difficult in the timeline that you're trying to approve a loan. So if that process takes 6 and 7 and 8 months, it's very hard to keep that application active and to really be able to feel confident that that's going to close.
As I said before, you know, it's working with that source of capital for the grants is, you know, really an issue. You know, I listened to my fellow panelists. We have, you know, appraisal bias issues in the communities in which we work. The equity is not there to be able to qualify for these loans. So this program then ends up destroying wealth versus, it being a wealth building type of program. And then the increase in property taxes. I don't think people are aware of that and prepared for that increase. And then some of these ADUs are not necessarily used to generate income. They're used for multi-generational housing. So you really have to look at the demographics in the different areas and the use cases. That's the point of, you know, this pilot repair program. And then I do think we have to lift the geographic restrictions and take another look at that, because we can look at our denials. A lot of people are coming in because they're not in that geographic range and they're being denied because of that. And, you know, people have learned, and at least in the communities in which we work, they've learned how to survive. So 97% of the people that have been denied for our repair program is because they have an illegal unit. And so the program was built to bring those units up to compliance, but who knows what they've built down there in order to generate, some income. So that's also a challenge that, with this program as well.
And Jesse, any final thoughts about challenges?
High rates and high taxes. You know, there's a thing called a self-sufficiency test that we have to pass on 3 and 4 units, and that can be probably one of my biggest hurdles. You don't see taxes go down too much, but hopefully rates will get to a place where that is less of an issue. But for the most part, my product is pretty inclusive. I mean, we can do these down to a 580 credit score. We can use 110% of the future value. I can use 75% of the future rental income that's not even there yet. So it's not the program that's my issue. It's that test typically that will be a hard stop for me.
Wonderful. That's really helpful. And so again, I'd really love to shift into thinking about opportunities. Where are there opportunities for partnerships with folks in this room, partnerships with other institutions, partnerships with government, to start thinking about ways to kind of mitigate these problems? And I don't know, Roz, is there sort of any low-hanging fruit? Is there a good place to start?
As far as partnerships, wherever ADUs can be layered into an existing program, I think those incentive programs, I don't think they should be limited to single family homes. I think they should be extended wherever possible to multifamily owners. And I also think it's kind of, it's a win for the city. It's a win for the for-profit and nonprofit developers. And when we have those rare instances of common ground, we should use the advocates in all those spaces to appeal to City Hall and our older men and women and all those people that can help expand that pilot area and make those changes. And also, education, obviously, of realtors, the HUD consultants that Jesse talked about, the appraisers, all that all kind of works towards the effort.
And so the purpose of the CIBC program is to get vacant, foreclosed, and abandoned housing that's blighting neighborhoods into homeownership and hopefully generating familial wealth over time. And if you, in one of the biggest challenges in the low and moderate income areas is the combination of the appraisal gap, the appraisal bias. It's that things don't appraise out to values that as a federally regulated banking institution, I can lend against. And I just have these bright line limits as a bank based on the outcome of the appraisal. If you look at the amount of dollars that the city of Chicago puts into rental properties as subsidy on a per unit basis, it's an extraordinary amount of subsidy that's going into affordable rental projects. And I do a lot of work on the affordable rental side, and I think it's needed and it's very important and beneficial. However, if you put even a fraction of the amount that is going into rental into single family, it would make a tremendous difference at stabilizing the neighborhoods. The rental properties are large properties that are located on corners and they're not in the neighborhoods. But if you brought those dollars into the neighborhoods, started improving the single family homes, got homeowners in there and allowed them to benefit from the appreciation of wealth over time, that shifting of subsidy towards single family could make a tremendous improvement.
I listened to my partners on this panel and, as a nonprofit, we have a lot of those resources, particularly information that's already in place. We do home ownership education, and that's a way to infuse this knowledge about, ADUs when people are making that decision to purchase a home. And whether it's, a single family home or a 2 to 4 unit home, it's like, how do I extract value out of that home? We have a construction services team that can go out and actually, assess, the building. They actually have a relationship with a lot of general contractors in this area. And so, work with that homeowner to do that bid analysis. So we have a lot of these things in place, but it's getting the support for that as a nonprofit, right? If we're going to have an ADU desk, that's not a problem. We have this network and this relationship with the aldermen. I know the other panel was talking about that. And again, have the relationship with the community development organizations as well to disseminate that information. But it's, again, I got to pay people, it's about getting support for that. And as a city, having that concentrated effort, I think we have to decide, at least from a repair and a grant program, what are we trying to do here, right? What is the, what is the issue? Is racial equity an issue, and how do we infuse that in our decision making? Are we trying to, build wealth? Are we trying to preserve wealth? Are we trying to stabilize housing? We have to answer that question before we just roll out, so we can, really form our program accordingly.
When I think about networking with folks in the group, for me, truly, it is creating awareness. And so I don't know the exact audience and who sits in what seat, but just knowing that it's out there and spreading the word that there is a product out there that can help people. From being at a mortgage and a lending capacity, I get excited about helping people getting out of the rent space and creating that wealth through owning something. And then when you start to couple that with the passive income that can be generated with the multi-unit, and obviously that includes ADUs as well, is it starts to make their lives at the mortgage more affordable. I've had folks who have bought a multi-unit, rehabbed it, rented out, and had no housing payment and walked out of just from the closing alone, having instant equity in the property. And I get excited when I see folks that didn't even think owning something was possible, and now they're on solid footing for the future. So, but aging in place and those other things are real. And I think that can be a beautiful situation when you can spend your later years around family and loved ones too. So I just think there's a lot of benefits from this, and creating awareness around lending opportunities and construction architect opportunities, as well as, you know, what all the other folks can bring is important.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate your thoughtful responses and your thoughtfulness about this. I would love to open it up to Q&A. Yes, I see that you have your hand up.
So I'm a real estate agent and I work with a lot of artists, entrepreneurs, people who co-buy multiple households buying a building together. Affordability is really important to my clients, and something that I've been saying, which is probably wrong and I should stop saying now, is at least in these pilot areas, I've been saying like, oh, and in the future, if you want to build an ADU, this is another way that you can, you know, build wealth or invest in the property. It's also, since the takes so long, all these other things, like it's definitely something that I've been talking to my clients about as something that they could purchase the property and then do this. That 203K loan, very familiar with it, but that is for purchasing the whole property. So are there any financial products for people who already own the property and just want to, you know, spend $100,000 adding a unit?
Yeah, Jesse, that would be great.
The 203K does allow you to refi as well. So, and Fannie and Freddie, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac both have a product as well, purchase and refi. We do VA as well. So there's a lot of different options. It's just in the multi-unit space, typically it fits FHA the best.
And CIC can also do a refi and include that rehab and refinance.
Yes.
I'd like to back this up a little bit. I appreciate your sophisticated financial skills, though I don't share those. I'm only an architect, but I had to learn a little bit about this through dealing with people that are interested in ADUs. And I'm wondering if you could give us a little bit of insight, maybe hang yourselves a bit as to what the value add would be that you see out there, or what would be a range of value add that people might expect for their properties when dealing with an appraiser or someone of that sort. Thank you.
Anytime I'm dealing with adding value, it's above grade, livable square footage. I mean, kitchens and baths, of course. Those are what they're looking for, but then it does come down to comparables, right? So you're somewhat subject to what the market's doing. A, are there enough comps? But B, what's happened? Technically, they will go back 12 months and they will go outside of a mile radius, but the closer in time and closer in proximity, and obviously like model is going to have the most weight. So they'll give us up to 5 comparables. But like I said, similar comps, proximity and time, then start to really dial in what they put more weight to.
That's where I think it gets complicated for single family homes, where the value of the finished space for the owner is more valuable than the income stream of the rental property. I think that's going to depend a lot on location, because rents in some areas are going to be significantly higher than in other areas. And in theory, like, you can back into the additional value of that unit by taking the present value of the monthly rental income stream. That's in theory what's going to be factored into the appraisal, but in reality, given the small scale of these properties, you're probably looking more at the sales comparison method. This is really getting into the weeds. In reality, I'm probably going to see numbers, appraisal numbers, that are all over the place, depending on where the property is located, who the appraiser is, who the immediate sales, what the immediate sales comps look like. I guess in reality, I don't have a good answer, other than to say it's complicated and who knows.
Which to say, I think that's part of the challenge that you all have been articulating, right? That it's very, in particular, early in this very early stage of ADUs, there aren't a lot of comps. The appraisers may or may not know the best way to appraise them. And so it sounds like that's a substantial challenge. Other questions?
Real quick, just
Oh,
the main one for me would be the coach house. Because if you're doing a 2-unit and finishing a basement, there's 3-unit comps all day long, right? If you're doing I'm saying, like, we don't have a lot of the coach houses, is probably the one that would throw my appraisal off more than anything else.
And I think I saw a question over here.
Thanks, Emily. So my name is John Womack. I have a company called Third City Properties. We own and manage property on the west and the northwest side. We probably have 12 potential units across a handful of buildings and basement units that we'd like to build out. The challenges are enormous. They're all the ones you guys covered: infrastructure, upgrading electrical, upgrading the water service line, installing drain tile systems, sprinkler systems. On the financing side, I think the biggest reason we didn't move forward with the project a few years ago, it's a project in Galewood, 9 units. We could add 3 basement units. I think the cost of construction is maybe $300,000. And I think the additional value that we'd add would be about $240,000. And I think that's the reason that there weren't more ADUs being built on the south and west side more than anything, compared to the north side, kind of back to earlier. But the main reason we're not moving forward with that project, I haven't even mentioned yet, is our lender won't allow a secondary lien. So just curious, have you guys ran into that whenever you're trying to do a rehab loan? And what would your position be if you were the primary lien holder?
So I'm doing commercial financing and I need a first mortgage. If you have other loans in place, I have to refinance those out. That's bottom line.
And we also, for our first mortgage lending, we don't allow loans behind us. That being said, we offer lots of loan products that are second mortgages behind us. So if it can be, if it's on one of our properties that we have the first, we can work with that. We're flexible in some ways.
So we actually offer through our neighborhood lending services group, purchase rehab. And so if somebody's doing a new purchase, we actually will do a first mortgage lending and we'll offer a purchase rehab program. We will offer a purchase rehab program, lending program.
I was out past 4 units. I was out after 4 units, so I can't help you.
Same question for
Yeah, it would be one with no liens behind us. Would be, we do the construction and renovation, all 130-year fixed mortgage.
Nobody allows to give a rehab loan if they're not the primary holder, right? Is that right? That's just
correct.
So I also work in the multifamily affordable space, and we see subordinate liens there all the time. They're not subsequent subordinate liens. They're a comprehensive rehabilitation that takes multiple layers of financing all coming together simultaneously. So I'm totally comfortable with subordinate financing, but it depends on the circumstance. And if I have the first mortgage on a property that has been rehabilitated or in theory rehabilitated, the subsequent like one-off rehabilitation over additional units is probably going to require a refinancing of the overall project. Anytime you're doing something to change the nature of the project, that's going to trigger an overall revision or review of the financing structure.
And I just want to clarify real quick, we do allow subordinate liens behind us. We just won't be second in position when we have a large mortgage.
And I think that's it. Thank you so much, panel. I think there's a lot more to discuss during lunch and our conversation then. Again, thank you all so much. I really appreciate all of your thoughtfulness here.